The story begins on an immense sea of grass, the Eurasian steppe, where wind and horizon measured the lives of those who rode across it. This land was not a place of gentle farms and steady towns, but of moving camps, seasonal routes, and a hard intimacy with horses and sky. People who lived here were shaped by the vastness. They learned to see the world in distances and speed, and the way a tossed spear could decide an argument and the weather could write the year. It is from this landscape, from these rhythms and necessities, that the Huns emerged into the written record and into the imaginations of empires to their west. Subscribe right now if you dare to ride with the Huns through storms of fire and iron. Only the fearless will follow this story to the end. To speak of the Huns is to attempt to speak of a phenomenon rather than a fixed people, because the steppe produced groups that could change faster than sedentary societies. Names given to them by others, Huns, Sungnu, Chunni, echoed with ambiguity. There were sometimes confederations of many clans, sometimes bands of raiders, sometimes armies that absorbed conquered peoples and peoples who in turn absorbed them. Their identity was elastic, shaped by movement and by contact, and historians must listen to many voices, archaeology, contemporary chroniclers, and the distant traditions of those they encountered, to assemble a plausible picture. Long before Attila's name crossed the Roman pen, steppe peoples had been galloping across the grasslands for centuries. The great predecessors of the Huns, such as the Scythians and later the Sarmatians, had perfected mounted warfare and a nomadic economy that relied on mobility, animal husbandry, and trade. The technological core of these societies was simple but decisive: efficient saddles, composite bows, and the skill to fight from horseback with control and speed. These innovations allowed relatively small groups to exert influence far beyond the numbers they represented, as they could strike hard, vanish, and regroup on miles of unbroken plain. Climate and ecology mattered as much as steel. The steppe stretched from the Pannonian Basin in Central Europe to the borders of China, an expanse of grasslands that offered both corridor and crucible. Periods of colder, drier weather pushed populations westward, sometimes in waves, and pushed others into new alliances or conflict. Rivers and lowland forests framed routes of migration just as surely as mountain passes or deserts did, and these natural features channeled the movement of people, herds, and armies. To understand the rise of the Huns, one must picture not merely armies but the cascade of environmental pressures, the same forces that had driven earlier groups into new theaters of action. We should also hear the horse. The story of the Huns is inseparable from the animal that carried them, and horses were living engines of mobility and warfare. Breeds on the steppe were hardy, small by modern standards, and extraordinarily sure-footed. Their endurance allowed long-distance raids and rapid redeployments. Training in horsemanship began in childhood, and a rider could handle bow, lance, and reins with an ease that made them terrifying to those accustomed to foot soldiers. The composite bow, designed to fire from the back of a galloping horse, meant that the hunter and warrior aspects of life blurred together. The same skills that brought food also brought political power. By the late antique centuries, the Huns appeared on the edges of the Roman consciousness like a menacing silhouette. Eastern sources connected them with earlier steppe confederations we now call the Xiongnu, who had confronted China's Han dynasty centuries earlier. Whether the Huns were direct descendants of the Xiongnu is debated, but ideas and technologies certainly flowed across the inner Asian world, creating a shared matrix of nomadic practices. When bands of mounted warriors pressed into the territories north of the Black Sea and then into Europe, they encountered a fractured map of peoples: Goths, Alans, Vandals, and others, some of whom had themselves been displaced by previous movements. The first large westward movements were not simple invasions with a single purpose. They were often cascading migrations induced by pressure from the east. A tribe pushed out by hunger, drought, or conflict could push into its neighbor's land, unsettling the balance. The Huns' advance into Europe in the late 4th and early 5th centuries functioned as both war and migration, a blunt instrument that disrupted settled life and created opportunities for those who could adapt. Some local groups were annihilated, others assimilated, and some found temporary refuge within Roman frontiers, but all were affected by this sudden, mobile presence. Rome, exhausted by internal strains and external pressures, confronted a new kind of opponent. The classical legions had been forged for battlefields where heavy infantry held lines and sieges lasted months. They were not optimized to chase riders across open terrain. The Huns did not seek to storm every city with ladders and battering rams. They specialized in rapid assaults and making rivers hazardous and roads insecure, an extortion through strategic raids that yielded tribute as reliably as battlefield victory could. Diplomacy, bribery, and sudden violence became tools in a repertoire that Roman generals learned to fear and, at times, to employ. Before Attila rose to prominence, the Huns were already integrated into European politics as mercenaries, raiders, and federated allies. The late Roman practice of foederati, employing barbarian troops within the imperial army, meant that Huns often fought on both sides of conflicts, their allegiance fluid and their motives pragmatic. They sought plunder, land, and recognition. They accepted Roman gold when it suited them and turned on former employers when opportunities appeared. This mercenary function gave the Huns insight into Roman tactics, logistics, and internal rivalries, advantages they would exploit as they grew bolder. The man who would be remembered as Attila was born into this charged environment, but his origins are shrouded by the patchwork of sources. Contemporary historians such as Priscus, a Byzantine diplomat who later wrote eyewitness accounts, provide glimpses. Later chroniclers in the Latin West and Greek East shaped Attila's image into legend, mixing fact with narrative convenience. What emerges, cautiously, is a picture of a leader who was both product and shaper of his age. A commander who could enforce authority among fractious steppe aristocrats and who knew how to extract maximum advantage from the vulnerabilities of empire. Attila shared power for part of his life with his brother Bleda. For a time, they co-ruled the Hunnic Confederation. Their joint reign represented a common steppe strategy. Dual kingship could stabilize competing claims among clans and prevent excessive fragmentation. Together they pushed the frontiers of the Huns westward, receiving titles and tribute from Rome in exchange for peace or cooperation, and initiating campaigns that tested the durability of both edges of the empire. The balance changed abruptly when Bleda died under mysterious circumstances, after which Attila became sole ruler, consolidating power with a ruthlessness that made him feared by both his allies and his enemies. Attila's leadership style combined charisma, coercion, and a deep understanding of the steppe value system. He could reward loyalty lavishly and punish dissent brutally, and he used marriage alliances, hostages, and the distribution of plunder to secure the loyalty of subordinate chieftains. He respected the traditions of mounted warfare and also appreciated the benefits of incorporating engineers, siege weaponry, and Roman auxiliaries into his forces. This hybrid approach, nomadic speed plus siegecraft, made Attila's armies versatile and terrifying across the varied terrain of Europe. The campaigns of Attila into the Roman Balkans and the rich cities of Gaul and Italy became the stuff of political theater. He demanded tribute and used diplomacy like a blade, testing imperial resolve and then striking where weakness showed. When the Western Roman Emperor could not or would not pay, Attila's raids turned into invasions that devastated countryside and towns alike, seizing wealth and captives. But Attila was not merely a destructively minded brigand. Sometimes he sought negotiated settlements that would enhance his prestige and the economic basis of his power. Tribute was both a practical revenue stream and a symbolic affirmation of dominance. One of the most consequential confrontations came in 451 at the Catalonian plains, where a Roman coalition led by Aetius confronted Attila's force in what contemporaries hailed as a trial by arms for the fate of Gaul. The battle was ferocious, brutal, and indecisive in some senses, because both sides suffered immense losses and neither secured a decisive annihilation of the other. Attila withdrew after the fight, his aura of invincibility dented but not destroyed. The campaign revealed the limits of even a great nomadic army when facing an organized, determined coalition and underscored the way steppe armies had to adapt to diverse environments and tactics. The invasion of Italy in 452 showcased Attila's capacity to apply pressure strategically. He moved with speed into the Italian peninsula, threatening cities and extracting massive tribute from the imperial authorities who could not immediately assemble an army to stop him. The site of Rome itself, a city long past its imperial heyday but still the symbol of Mediterranean civilization, brought him to negotiations. The circumstances that led to his withdrawal, diplomacy, plague, and famine are variously cited, highlight how environmental and political factors combine to decide military outcomes. Even for a commander as audacious as Attila, comment now: would you have defended Rome to your last breath, or ridden with Attila to crush it into dust? Choose your side and write it below. Throughout these years, Attila cultivated an image designed to inspire both fear and compliance. He would sometimes be depicted in awe-inspiring terms, as the scourge of God by Christian writers or as a pragmatic ruler in pagan accounts. His court, assembled from the spoils of conquest and the retinues of allied chiefs, became a crucible for the multi-ethnic nature of his rule. The Hunnic elite incorporated Goths, Alans, and other groups, mercenaries and artisans flowed into his orbit, blending steppe traditions with local practices in a way that made his polity more than a simple tribe. To understand Attila's movement westward is also to understand the logistical realities of the steppe model. A nomadic confederation's ability to project power depended upon supply lines of fodder, water, and the constant maintenance of mounted troops. Foraging and living off the land could sustain them for a time, but extended sieges and holding urban territories required different arrangements. Thus, Attila's campaigns often oscillated between swift strikes designed to seize valuables and longer operations that leveraged siege engineers and local compliance to extract more permanent tribute. The Huns' interaction with Roman society was not limited to the battlefield. Trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and marriage all created ties between steppe and city. Roman gold financed Hunnic loyalty at times, and Roman craftsmen were captured or supplied to the Huns to create arms and luxury goods. This entanglement created dependencies. The Huns needed some Roman goods and recognition, while Rome needed to manage a violent and unpredictable neighbor without the resources for full-scale resistance. The result was a relationship of mutual exploitation and mutual dread, with each side using the other to achieve short-term goals. Attila's death in 453 remains shrouded in rumor and fragmentary testimony, recounted differently by various chroniclers. Some writers claimed he bled to death on his wedding night after a drunken celebration, others suggested assassination or a staged accident. Whatever the immediate cause, his death precipitated a rapid unraveling of the Hunnic Confederation. The system of loyalty Attila had built rested heavily on his personal authority and the incentives he dispensed, and without him, centrifugal forces between subordinate leaders flared into open dissent. The dissolution of Hunnic unity after Attila's death illustrates how charismatic rule can be both formative and fragile. Within a few years, internal quarrels, combined with rebellions by subject peoples and renewed pressure from other steppe groups, tore the Huns apart as a coherent political force. Many of the tribes and peoples who had allied with Attila drifted away, assimilated into new polities, or returned to the pastoral vagabond life that kept them nimble and elusive. The Huns did not vanish entirely, of course. Their genetic and cultural traces mixed into the populations of Europe, and their military innovations continued to influence others. Archaeology has searched for the material contours of Hunnic life, trying to map burial mounds, weapon caches, and portable treasures to the written accounts. Grave goods reveal a martial ethos, ornate weapons, horse harness fittings, and sometimes gold belt buckles indicate the wealth and status of individuals. Yet the archaeological record is complicated by the nomadic tendency to leave ephemeral traces and by the wide diffusion of steppe material culture among different groups. The physical remnants that do survive allow us to see the Huns as creative in material culture, adept at blending imported art styles with functional, mobile needs. Linguistics has tried to capture the voice of the Huns, but with limited success. The Hunnic language, if we can call it a single language, left very few words in historical texts, mostly names and titles. Scholars have proposed links to Turkic, Mongolic, Finno-Ugric, and Iranic languages, but no consensus has emerged. This linguistic silence mirrors the political reality. The Huns were a confederation of diverse peoples whose unifying elements were military practice and shared culture rather than a single tongue that can be neatly reconstructed. The steppe's broader history helps explain why such confederations emerged repeatedly. Some scholars speak of the steppe city syndrome, a cycle in which charismatic leaders coalesce a variety of clans into a polity and then see those polities fragment after the leader's death. This pattern repeats from the Xiongnu through the Gokturks and later the Mongols, because the economic base, mobile pastoralism, is inherently decentralized. Leaders could create stunning empires, but the structural basis of those empires made long-term, centralized institutional stabilization difficult. Yet the idea that the Huns left no institutional legacy is mistaken. Their impact survived in subtler ways. Military tactics spread into the armies of sedentary states, and the political geography of Europe was reshaped by the chain reactions their presence set off. The migrations they caused, whether by pushing tribes westward or creating power vacuums, contributed to the formation of new ethnic identities and to the realignment of political borders. Rome itself adapted, sometimes hiring steppe tactics and sometimes reorganizing its forces to better meet the challenges from mobile enemies. The Huns also entered the medieval imagination as archetypes. Christian writers often cast them as instruments of God's wrath, a convenient way to moralize chaos and calamity. Poets and chroniclers endowed Attila with monstrous attributes or, conversely, with a tragic grandeur that made him a symbol beyond his historical footprint. These literary transformations affected how later generations remembered the Huns, as barbaric destroyers in some narratives, and as noble savages or even proto-national heroes in others, depending on the needs and prejudices of storytellers. Modern scholarship has worked to strip away these rhetorical layers and reconstruct the Huns as historical actors on their own terms. This work is painstaking because source material is fragmentary and colored by the biases of those who wrote about them. But by comparing written accounts, archaeology, and environmental data, historians and archaeologists can create a richer, more textured narrative. The image that emerges is not of a monolithic marauding horde but of a flexible, adaptive confederation that used the steppes' logic to its advantage and whose fortunes were deeply entwined with the complexities of late antiquity. Recent genetic studies have added another dimension to our understanding, revealing a complex mosaic rather than a single origin. DNA evidence from burial sites shows mixtures of East Asian, Central Asian, and European ancestry in some Hunnic-associated graves, confirming the mosaic nature long suspected by historians. These findings do not settle debates about language or political continuity with Eastern confederations, but they do underscore how the steppe was a crossroads where peoples interbred, exchanged goods, and reorganized their social worlds. To fully grasp the rise of the Huns, one must also consider their economic underpinnings. Pastoralism required mobility, but it also relied on trade to obtain goods that horses and sheep could not provide: textiles, iron tools, and luxury items. Steppe leaders engaged in trade networks that stretched from China to Byzantium, exchanging hides, slaves, and animal products for silks, coin, and metalwork. Control of trade routes and access to markets could enhance a leader's power almost as much as winning battles, and Attila's reign reflected a keen awareness of economic leverage. Religion among the Huns was diverse and adaptable, often syncretic, and not centralized. Animistic beliefs, reverence for sky gods and natural forces, and shamanic practices likely coexisted with the gods of subject peoples such as the Goths or the Alans. Contact with Christianity in the Roman world introduced new religious dynamics. Arian Christianity, practiced by many Goths, found some traction among groups allied to the Huns, while Roman clerics sought to evangelize and to portray Hunnic invasions as moral tests. But the Huns were pragmatic. Religious affiliation could be a political tool as readily as a matter of faith. The Hunnic approach to urban centers was also pragmatic. They were more comfortable in the open than in the narrow streets of a walled city, yet they understood the value of cities as sources of tribute, manpower, and prestige. In some campaigns, they bypassed urban fortifications through negotiation and bribery, and in others they invested in siegecraft. Their relationship with urban life was therefore ambivalent, comprised of theft and destruction on one hand and strategic engagement on the other. When we paint a mental image of Attila's court, it is important not to imagine a single, fixed capital like Rome or Constantinople. The Hunnic center was mobile, a shifting locus of power that moved with the seasons and the needs of the leader. Royal tents, movable workshops, and encampments filled with craftsmen and concubines formed a peripatetic seat that projected authority across the steppe. Yet even as mobility defined them, elements of ceremonial and hierarchy borrowed from sedentary neighbors, such as titles, ritual gifts, and displays of wealth, helped legitimize rule. As the post-Attila Hunnic world fragmented, some groups moved into newly available niches, integrating into local societies while others vanished into the background. Former Hunnic commanders sometimes entered Roman service, and Hunnic military techniques flowed into emerging medieval armies. In Eastern Europe, new confederations and tribal dynamics arose, and over centuries these patterns contributed to the ethnic map of the medieval world. The echoes of Hunnic presence thus persisted, like faint footprints across a plain, affecting subsequent polities and migrations. The cultural legacy of the Huns extended into material arts as well. the ornamentation of belts, horse trappings, and weaponry influenced Germanic and later medieval aesthetics. Artistic motifs flowed across cultural boundaries, adapted by local artisans and reinterpreted in new contexts. The steppe aesthetic, dynamic animal forms, stylized knots, and composite patterns, found its way into the decorative programs of many European artifacts, a subtle testament to cross-cultural exchange under pressure and in peace. It is also worth reflecting on the ethical and moralizations applied to the Huns through history. They were often cast as the other who stood outside the civilized order, a convenient mirror for anxieties about disorder and decline. Such portrayals served rhetorical purposes, especially for writers who wished to explain why empires fall or demoralize on the corruptions of power. Modern perspectives try to de-exoticize the Huns and view them as actors with their own logic and legitimate strategies for survival in a precarious world. Comparative studies help place the Huns within a broader pattern of steppe empires. From the Xiongnu to the Mongols, the steppe repeatedly produced leaders who could assemble diverse nomadic peoples into military machines. The techniques of governance often involved gift exchange, marriage, the distribution of plunder, and the promise of profit through raid and trade. The Huns fit within this recurring logic, but their particular historical moment, interacting with a declining Roman system, gave them disproportionate influence on European history. The notion of barbarian invasions tends to flatten complex migratory and political dynamics into a single dramatic image, but the movements involving the Huns were often opportunistic and layered. Some groups fled ahead of them, some allied with them, some absorbed them, and some reinvented their identities in response. Understanding these movements requires us to see them as processes unfolding over decades, involving negotiation and adaptation as often as outright destruction. A final part of the Hun story is the persistence of their name as a symbol. In medieval rhyme and in nationalist mythologies of later centuries, Hun became a term loaded with connotation. It could mean foreignness, threat, or romanticized freedom depending on the teller. That cultural afterlife should not distract from the historical Huns, but it does reveal how certain names can outlive their reference and become shorthand for broader anxieties. Stepping back, the rise of the Huns illuminates the dynamic interface between mobile pastoral societies and settled empires. It shows how ecological conditions, technological mastery of horsemanship, diplomatic agility, and charismatic leadership can combine to reshape vast regions. The Huns were not a simple destroyer of civilization, they were a channel through which new configurations of power, economy, and culture flowed across Europe and Asia. Their story reminds us that history is made not only in palaces and battlefields, but in the measure of grasses, the bend of a bow, and the sound of hooves on open ground. The human dimension of this story is also crucial. Behind the grand narratives were families, artisans, captives, and children whose lives were altered by migration and conflict. A caravan crossing the plain carried not only warriors but also cooks, healers, and craftspeople, all of whom contributed to the resilience of nomadic groups. When cities emptied and borders shifted, it was these ordinary lives that bore the immediate consequences of imperial policy and natural calamity. There is also a lesson about adaptability. The Huns survived and thrived as long as they could adapt to new opportunities and incorporate new resources, whether that meant employing Roman siege engineers or taking craftsmen into their camps. Their decline followed when adaptation failed to keep pace with the changing political environment, when charismatic authority could not be institutionalized, and when subject peoples found means to resist or to reassert their own autonomy. Exploring the steppe itself offers an imaginative return to landscapes that many in the modern world seldom encounter. If you close your eyes and imagine standing on a wide plateau as sun and wind move across the grasses, you can feel why mobility dominated the culture there. The horizon became a political and logistical category, and the people's relationship to distance made them unpredictable to empires used to fixed boundaries. The Huns rose from this ecology, and it shaped every choice they made. Finally, the history of Attila and the Huns is a story of contact, not isolation. Their most consequential acts were responses to the rich and fading civilizations they encountered, and in turn those civilizations were transformed by the encounter. Empires borrowed military ideas and political practices, steppe societies acquired urban goods and new administrative impulses. The result was a transitional world in which old certainties dissolved and new formations, not always stable, often messy, began to take shape. To listen to this history is to hear the overlap of steppes and cities, horses and human hands, and the steady negotiation between mobility and permanence. It is a history that resists simple moral judgments and instead asks us to consider how environments create options, how leaders exploit those options, and how ordinary people navigate the consequences. Attila's shadow in history is long because the processes he embodied, migration, adaptation, and confrontation between different lifeways, continued to shape Eurasia for centuries after his death. The Hun story also invites reflection on the sources we rely upon. Contemporary accounts were authored by people whose worldviews shaped their descriptions, and archaeology fills gaps but cannot speak with a single voice. Interpreting these fragments requires humility and an openness to uncertainty. Yet from this difficult work emerges a textured narrative of a people who changed the game of late antiquity simply by being who they were, mobile, martial, and unbowed by the constraints of sedentary institutions. In the end, the rise of the Huns harbors lessons about the contingency of empires and the power of adaptation. Attila's conquests forced Romans to confront the limits of their military and fiscal systems, and his campaigns accelerated processes already underway in a transforming world. The Huns themselves were not merely agents of destruction, they shaped new syntheses, and their legacy can be traced in military tactics, cultural motifs, and the ethnic landscapes that followed their era. As you drive or go about your day, imagine the sound of hooves fading over endless grass, the glint of a bow, a leader addressing a tentful of chiefs, and a ragged column moving beneath a wide, indifferent sky. The history of Attila and the Huns is a story of echoes, of people pressed by environment and opportunity into movements that altered the fate of empires. It is a story that asks us to see beyond caricature and to hear the nuanced, often contradictory voices of a world in motion. Their story is unfinished in the way all history is unfinished. It continues in the artifacts we find, the words we recover from old manuscripts, and the genetic signals in the bones beneath the earth. Each new discovery adds a thread to an already intricate tapestry. The Huns remind us that history is woven from many strands, some bright with dramatic events and others quiet and commonplace, and that the plane itself can determine the shape of human destiny. What endures is the image of a people who mastered movement and used it to command respect and wealth. Attila personified that mastery in ways small and large, through swift raids, devastating sieges, bold diplomacy, and the charisma that kept a fractious confederation together for a time. His life and the rise of the Huns offer a vivid case study in leadership, ecology, and the unforeseen consequences of human mobility. They illustrate how the geographic and technological conditions of one region can influence political outcomes across an entire continent. So when historians map the flow of peoples from east to west, when they chart the ebbing power of Rome or the rise of Germanic kingdoms, when they seek to understand the transformations of late antiquity, the Huns sit at a crucial intersection. They were both symptom and cause, an expression of steppe dynamism that turned local pressures into continental change. Their story shows that the fortunes of empires depend not only on legions and walls, but on horses, climate, and the restless energy of those who live in open lands. Finally, the legacy of Attila and the Huns prompts us to think about how we consider civilization itself. The Huns forced sedentary societies to confront different logics of life and war, and in doing so they contributed to the evolution of European polities. If civilization is a moving target shaped by contact and conflict, then the Huns were one of its most forceful shapers in the early medieval world. Their shadow remains long and complex, a reminder that history often turns on the meeting of worlds as much as on the designs of rulers. The first light of the story falls across a horizon of grass, not stone, where sky and land meet in a long, low line and wind tells all the tales it knows. This is the world into which Attila was born, a place where survival rode at full speed and reputations were made on the backs of horses. The landscape shaped its people the way cold shapes metal, by constant hammering in the heat of long days, and from that forging came the figures who would later stride into the histories of Rome and Europe. To imagine Attila's childhood is to imagine a child learning to sit the horse as soon as he could walk, to sleep under a hide with the stars as his ceiling, and to hear his elders talk of raids that took livestock, wives, and revenge. He belonged to a network of families and clans whose alliances changed like the weather, and his identity would have been braided from many strands: kinship, oath, the promises of a quarrel waiting to be fought. The precise records of his earliest years do not survive. Instead, we reconstruct him from the traces left by others, from the way later leaders behaved, and from the customs that bound steppe peoples into fighting communities. His family seems to have been prominent but not solitary at the top of power. He was likely a son of a man named Munzuk, and he was nephew to the man often described as Rua or Rugula, a ruler who had established the Huns as a force on the edge of the Roman world. Those relationships mattered. On the steppe, inheritance was not a simple line. Power passed through persuasion and the ability to gather supporters, and a boy born into the right family still had to become a man in the eyes of warriors and elders. Learning to fight was a composite of necessity and ritual. A young Hun would spend daylight and dusk painting muscle memory into his arms and shoulders, shooting an asymmetric composite bow from every angle, hurling javelins with precision, and riding at speed while steering with knees and shifting weight. Night drills were punctuated by songs and stories. Men repeated the deeds of ancestors, each retelling a pruning of weaknesses and an elevation of daring. This was more than training. It was the cultural curriculum for leadership, the schooling of a future chief. Horses were not tools so much as extensions of bodies. They were bred fast, kept lean, and thinned with hardship so that every sinew counted. Young riders learned to read the mood of a herd, to know when a mare would falter and when a stallion would seize command. A boy who could coax obedience from an unpredictable steed earned a reputation that followed him into adulthood, and for someone like Attila that reputation would coax allies and intimidate rivals. The weapons themselves were both elegant and brutal. The composite bow, made of horn, sinew, wood, and glue, curved with a power that surprised heavier arms. Its arrows were designed for speed and penetration, and Hunnic archery preferred mobility and continuous harassment over frontal clogging engagements. They seldom fought like Roman legions with long lines trading blows. Instead, they wore enemies down, using speed, feigned retreats, and sudden returns to break the discipline of more sedentary foes. Beyond skill with arms, a future ruler learned the economy of raiding. Young leaders watched elders negotiate for captives, decide which horses to keep and which to slaughter, and calculate how to turn a quick strike into political leverage. Because the Huns did not build cities in the Roman sense, wealth was portable: flocks, crafted metal, human labor, and the plunder of walled estates. Attila grew up in a system where power meant the ability to redistribute goods and favor. His authority would later depend on that skill to bind followers to him. Language and diplomacy were as important as swordplay. The Huns were not a monolithic people. They absorbed Goths, Alans, and other groups, and they depended on negotiation in multiple tongues. To speak effectively with Roman envoys or to mediate between rivals among subject peoples required a mind that could translate more than words, habits, expectations, and shame. Despite later depictions that painted him as a brute, Attila had to master subtleties of bargaining long before he mastered battlefields. The spiritual world of the Huns was both intimate and ambiguous to outsiders. They held beliefs that mixed shamanic practices, ancestor reverence, and the kind of luck-based rituals that could be read by wind, horse behavior, or the positioning of a bird. For a leader, rites conferred legitimacy. To be blessed by shamans and respected by elders implied a mandate that no single arrow could grant. Attila would have been raised amid these rituals, learning how to invoke sacred language when it suited him and to present himself as the living embodiment of his people's fate. As he grew, his reputation would have been tempered by the politics of kinship. Men who wanted to rule needed not only valor but networks of obligation, marriages arranged to cement alliances, feasts to show largesse, and choices in distribution that built loyalty. Attila's family, rising within the Hunnic Confederation, had to compete by demonstrating the ability to maintain coalition. He learned the arithmetic of favors, how many horses to give, which clans to honor in council, and when to punish without fracturing the fragile pacts that kept the loose empire together. The Huns themselves were shadowy in Roman eyes, a name attached to riders clad in furs and riding across borders with a habit of sudden violence. Roman writers dramatized them as monstrous, but the truth was more complex. A culture of mobility demanded both cruelty and calculation, cruelty to deter enemies and calculation to ensure that every strike produced more benefit than cost. Attila's training occurred amid that paradox, where terror was a tool and so were treaties bought with gold. Two names became central when power shifted: Attila and his brother Bleda. They emerged as leaders during a moment when the Huns had consolidated influence near the Danube and were pressing their advantage into Roman territories. Their ascent to rule alongside an older generation reveals how leadership often passed by a mixture of succession and election, of force and acceptance. Wicked stories would later frame their joint rule as uneasy, but at first it may have functioned as a stabilizing partnership. Co-rulership required a kind of theatrical charm. Each ruler had to present himself as indispensable while not undermining his partner to the point of civil war. The pair shared command of raids, negotiated treaties, and accepted tribute that confirmed Hunnic supremacy. Attila, even while sharing power, learned to cultivate his image, to practice the gestures that impressed emissaries, a measured pause before he spoke, a grin that could be warm or ravenous, a capacity to listen before striking, This was all part of the training that turned a brave rider into a commander. The transition from bold warrior to strategic leader depended on experience with Roman politics. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its wealth and paperwork, offered both danger and delight. It could be extorted with threats of raids, currying the favor of a Hun king with gifts. It could also be bribed into treaties that effectively recognized a Hun polity's right to exist. Attila learned to manipulate that relationship, sometimes pushing until Rome paid, and sometimes stepping back to allow internal fractures to mend. It was a financial as well as a martial apprenticeship. One of the earliest lessons was how to transform short-term plunder into long-term power. A raid could yield immediate rewards, slaves, gold, food, but sustaining a band of followers required consistent success and steady spoils. Attila proved skillful at converting the periodic influx of wealth into the patronage networks that made him indispensable. He built allegiances by rewarding followers lavishly when prudent, and by enforcing discipline when necessary, a combination that made disloyalty dangerous and loyalty profitable. Behind that political economy was a keen attention to the mechanics of warfare beyond the open steppe. The Huns learned from their captives and neighbors how to besiege fortified places, to employ siege engines, to negotiate surrender terms that preserved lives or resources they needed. Attila observed these adaptations and used them. He would later confront fortified Roman towns not merely as a barbarian battering ram but as an opponent who understood the logistics of long operations and the value of negotiation in the shadow of the ramparts. Personal habits shaped his authority as much as public gestures. Roman chroniclers painted him as a man of extremes, capable of sudden generosity and terrifying cruelty. While these sources are biased and sensational, they reveal a leader who cultivated unpredictability as a political tool. To be credible as a warlord meant keeping enemies and allies uncertain about your next action. A calculated reputation for ferocity could avoid fights altogether when it compelled others to capitulate before blood was spilled. Stories persist about his marriage alliances and domestic life, and while facts blur with legend, such bonds mattered politically. Marriages connected clans and absorbed resources, and a leader's household functioned as an inner court where favors were dispensed. Attila's relationships, both confirmed in some accounts and speculated in others, provided the social scaffolding for his rise, offering him both heirs and networks that stretched beyond immediate kin. The Hunnic Confederation did not obey a single legal code but a web of custom, and a ruler had to be adept at wielding both the stick and the embrace. In disputes he had to arbitrate, sometimes invoking the authority of ancestors or gods, but often relying on muscle and reputation. Attila's early years as a ruler sharpened his sense of timing in these matters, when to negotiate, when to amplify demands, when to threaten, and when to allow grudges to cool so they could be exploited at a later moment. An essential component of his education was the handling of diverse peoples under Hunnic dominion. Goths, Gepids, Alans, and other groups were gathered or subdued, and each required a different management style. Some were left in relative autonomy in exchange for military service, others were settled more strictly to serve as troops or laborers. Attila's methods combined clemency and severity. He could incorporate a foreign leader into his elite if it suited him, or eliminate competitors whose loyalties were suspect. The Huns were quick to adapt technologies from their neighbors, and Attila's circle encouraged innovation. Metalworkers from Roman territories, captive artisans, and subject peoples contributed to Hunnic armor, weapons, and craft. The leader who could harness those skills gained an edge: better horse gear, more efficient bows, and pieces of siegecraft that allowed Hunnic forces to assault fortified towns with increasing confidence. Attila's power grew when he became not only a master of mounted tactics but also a patron of the craftsmen who supplied his campaigns. Another formative element was the ritual of oath and the symbolism of power. A leader received seals and tokens that signified office. He listened to poets and prophets who recounted great deeds. He sat in councils where his demeanor mattered as much as his decree. For a young man learning to govern, mastering the language of authority was crucial. The way he accepted gifts, the posture he took at a feast, the stories he chose to tell about his lineage. Attila's charisma was cultivated deliberately, shaped by the needs of a man who knew that perception often conquered where spears could not. The relationship with his brother Bleda offers a window into the complexity of Hunnic rulership. Their joint command allowed them to expand operations and to present a solid front to Rome, yet co-rule also carried the seeds of competition. Attila's eventual sole rulership suggests either treachery, skillful politicking, or the simple attrition of power in a world where ambition and survival collided. Whatever the exact path, early power sharing taught him how to consolidate support and how to remove obstacles without igniting a civil war that would fracture the Confederation. As he matured, Attila accumulated the kind of experience that invited foreign attention. Roman embassies were not merely diplomatic errands, they were opportunities for the Hunnic king to display magnificence, to receive Roman envoys in sumptuous tents, to accept gold and to answer with polite threats. The dynamics of these meetings mattered. Haste could be read as arrogance, slowness as sloth, and a sharp observation could catch a Roman official off guard. Attila learned to perform the role of overlord not just on the battlefield but in the subtle theater of diplomacy. Perhaps part of his success lay in the way he combined personal austerity with public splendor. He could sleep on the ground like any horseman yet preside over banquets where the tents and captured silks declared his status. The contrast between rough living and the exploitation of symbols allowed him to speak with authenticity to his warriors while simultaneously intimidating and seducing the Roman elite. This balance made him an accessible leader to his followers and an enigmatic presence to his enemies. The Huns' reputation for sudden, devastating raids was not constructed overnight. It was the result of generations of experience in quick strikes across vast distances. Attila's schooling in such tactics taught him the value of surprise and the psychology of fear. A sudden attack could shatter a town's defenders, but worse for the enemy was the rumor of an impending strike. Rumor traveled faster than any messenger and often produced surrender without a single spear being thrown. Yet Attila would also learn the constraints of such mobility. Campaigning required supply lines, the maintenance of horses, and the management of captive populations. The best leaders could transform a winning raid into a sustainable political state, and that was the true test of a warlord. Attila's early movements show a developing understanding of logistics, of when to pull back and conserve force, and when to press an advantage to break the will of a more complex, stationary opponent like Rome. A crucial element in his making was the cultivation of spies and intelligence networks. Success on the steppe depended on knowing when an enemy was weak, which gate was lightly guarded, or which local leader could be persuaded to betray his patrons. Attila learned to use information as a weapon. Rumors were tested, scouts were trusted, and the timing of attacks often responded to whispers rather than open proclamations. This reliance on intelligence sharpened his strategic sense and allowed him to make decisions that looked prophetic to those with less insight. Religion and superstition continued to play roles as his power expanded. Whether he believed in destiny or used prophecies instrumentally, he acknowledged the moral value of sacred gestures. Shamans and seers could be allies in governance. A favorable omen could consolidate a wavering clan. A bad sign could be blamed on rivals. Attila was shrewd in using those elements. He could scorn a seer publicly and reward him privately, delegating spiritual authority while keeping political control. The interlacing with Roman internal troubles opened more opportunities. The Roman Empire, gradually fraying under economic strain and civil rot, provided a strategic landscape full of ambitions and betrayals. Attila's rise was not mere exploitation. It exploited Roman weakness and turned Roman divisions to advantage. A leader who could play 2 or 3 Roman factions against each other while maintaining a steady base at home would gain leverage far beyond the size of his cavalry. Personality accounts from later chroniclers give us a collage of images: ruthless, merciful, cunning, capricious, yet none captures the whole man. He was a product of the steppes demands and of the pressures of adolescence in a fractious polity, and that mixture created a leader who could be both merciless in battle and calculating in council. Attila's psychology, as much as his tactics, became a tool for extracting obedience. His legends say more about the fears he inspired than about any one true temperament. The early diplomatic victories were as educational as the battles were brutal. When Romans opted to pay tribute or sign treaties, Attila learned the value of institutionalizing gains. Tribute became a regular income stream. Treaties became a means of forcing the empire to acknowledge Hunnic power without risking a costly siege. That early strategy required patience and precise timing. A premature demand could unify Rome against him, while a prolonged peace could let competitors arise. Attila learned to steer between those perils. Allies and enemies within the Hunnic domain itself shaped his development. Some chieftains were too proud or too reluctant to accept a central leader. Others sought the protection of a strong ruler to secure their own positions. Attila had to be both charismatic and coercive, distributing favor to those who could tip the balance in his favor and eliminating those who would not. He learned to read loyalty and to finesse his alliances, a technique that served him as much on the opera of diplomacy as on the field of battle. The environment itself, winters that could be cruel, plains that became mud in spring, rivers that could halt a pursuit, reminded rulers that strategy must account for nature as well as people. Attila's campaigns were shaped by seasons, and his decisions showed an appreciation for timing that came from years of watching weather, herds, and enemy movements. To be effective meant not only to attack, but to choose the right moment to move, to shelter, and to demand tribute when the supplies of a foe were thin. Another lesson came from internal discipline. Hunnic bands needed uniform standards of conduct to remain coherent, and a leader could not allow plunder to degenerate into theft that alienated local populations necessary for provisioning or for securing trade. Attila refined the practice of centralized redistribution. He took the lion's share of treasure and returned much of it to loyal followers, creating a sense of dependency and gratitude. That mechanism transformed a scattering of bands into a polity more akin to an empire. The human cost of consolidation was not abstract. He ordered executions, negotiated the sale of captives, and sometimes brokered marriages that bought peace at the price of autonomy. Those choices created enemies and broken families, but they also stitched together a political fabric strong enough to repel challengers. Attila's early decisions, harsh as they could be, reflected the realities of survival in a world where weakness was swiftly punished. His understanding of Roman law and culture deepened through contact with prisoners, traders, and diplomats. He could read reports of Roman taxes, of internal disputes, and of how provincial governors feared revolt. That knowledge allowed him to make specific demands that would humiliate Rome while enriching his own coffers. Such strategies were not simply violent, they were surgical attacks on the prestige and cohesion of an empire that had taught every neighbor how to extract value from it. Some of the most telling moments in his development were private rather than public. Conversations by a fire, counsel with trusted lieutenants, nights where he weighed the lives of men and the fortunes of thousands, these personal deliberations shaped his choices. He learned to be decisive without being rash, a trait that separated him from leaders whose indecision led to catastrophic defeats. A warlord must choose quickly and accept the moral consequences, a burden Attila seems to have carried with grim savoir-faire. Training the next generation mattered to him. He cultivated sons and favored companions to serve as both heirs and deputies, ensuring continuity of command and loyalty. A ruler who could not install dependable subordinates risked fragmentation, and Attila was pragmatic in building a cadre of officers whose fortunes depended wholly on his continued success. That network multiplied his reach and allowed him to campaign in multiple directions in ways earlier leaders could not. Music, storytelling, and the crafting of myth played their roles in consolidating his aura. A ruler surrounded by bards and storytellers could have every success magnified into legend, turning a skirmish into an epic and a treaty into a triumph. Attila encouraged such narratives indirectly by rewarding those who told favorable tales and by cultivating a presence that invited myth-making. Over time, those stories hardened into the images we now inherit, some accurate, many exaggerated, but all useful for the psychological project of power. Pressure from other steppe groups kept his edge sharp. The Huns themselves faced rivals and opportunists. A leader who grew complacent would be quickly displaced. Attila's early years taught him to expect challenge not only from Rome but from within the steppe. Rival chieftains, ambitious sons of other leaders, or newly arrived bands seeking territory. The constant danger made him vigilant and resourceful, and it honed the quick, sometimes ruthless decisions that later made him feared across many lands. Even as he hardened, Attila absorbed lessons about mercy when it suited him. Sparing a city or a leader could create gratitude and a reputation for fairness that would pay dividends in future crises. Attila balanced brutality with calculated clemency. He could be the hammer or the hand extended, depending on the outcome that best protected his position. That versatility was a crucial ingredient in the making of his rule. Another formative influence was the presence of Roman military tactics to observe and learn from. The legions were not invincible, but their discipline and organization were instructive. Hunnic commanders, including Attila, gauged when to avoid the cohesion of heavy infantry and when to fracture it with persistent pressure. He integrated lessons from his enemies into his doctrine, such that his forces became more flexible and adaptive than those who clung to older conventions. Money and treasure shifted roles in his governance. Gold could buy peace, feed troops, and bind tribes, but it could also make men complacent. Attila's financial acumen evolved to use tribute as an arm of statecraft, converting immediate wealth into longer-term stability by investing in loyalty and military strength. This economic dimension distinguished his leadership from mere raiding chiefs. He built an apparatus that could sustain prolonged influence. By the time he cast aside any remaining shares of co-rule and became the primary figure of the Huns, his identity had been forged by decades of practice and choice. His earlier experiences, learning to ride, to bargain, to punish and forgive, combined to create the commanding persona he would present to Rome and all its neighbors. The transformation from a capable young warrior into a leader who could command a loose empire was as much a work of apprenticeship as of deliberate ambition. Attila's ascent also provides a lesson about timing. The mid-5th century painted a world in transition. Roman authority waned, new powers moved into the vacuum, and the Huns moved with a swiftness matched only by their audacity. Attila seized opportunities created by those wider changes. His rise was not inevitable, but it was the product of a man aligning his moment with his abilities. Chance favored him because he understood when to act and when to let fortune play its course. The psychological theater he cultivated grew more elaborate as his power increased. Messengers returned from Roman courts with gossip that fueled both fear and respect, and Attila learned to manipulate reputations across distance. A rumor he let spread could force governors to pay tribute without a fight, and his name alone could work as a currency stronger than gold. That reputation was the product of careful performance. A leader who mastered public impression could command places he never touched. The role of violence in his politics cannot be separated from the need for order. Attila sanctioned violence when it served to produce stability, and this utilitarian brutality was part of a larger logic. The authority of a ruler required occasional bloodletting to maintain discipline and deter rivals. Yet he also understood that unrestrained cruelty could backfire, creating cycles of revenge that would undermine his base. The balance he struck was pragmatic, even if morally disturbing to later chroniclers. His early years also show the importance of networks beyond immediate followers. Traders, captives, and envoys created links to distant markets, and those connections allowed Attila to procure metals, cloth, and other essentials necessary for a growing polity. He learned how to use markets to reinforce loyalty, buying local support by integrating trade with provincial economies. In this way, his rise was partly economic and partly military. The educational arc of Attila's early life culminated in a confidence that allowed him to undertake grand strategies. He could plan campaigns spanning seasons and negotiate with emperors while keeping an eye on the steps shifting alliances. A warlord's prudence is measured in the patience and foresight to endure setbacks and exploit openings. Attila developed both, and those traits allowed his voice to command not only horse camps but imperial audiences. When contemporary observers wrote of him, they often did so from fear or moral outrage, and their accounts must be read with caution. Yet even biased sources provide echoes of a leader who knew how to shape fear into obedience and respect into tribute. Ultimately, he reinvented the Hunnic position in European politics, turning a mobile confederation of horsemen into a player that Rome had to reckon with. His early life prepared him for that reinvention, equipping him with skills of combat, diplomacy, and image-making. As the years passed and his stature grew, the man who had once been taught to string a bow and coax a horse now dictated terms to emperors. But the elements of his upbringing, the horse, the bow, the oath, the feast, remained at his core. The making of Attila was not a single moment but a long accretion of seasons, choices, and learned behaviors that transformed a stepchild into the central actor of an age of upheaval. In the end, to understand Attila's early life is to appreciate the subtle interplay of environment, culture, kinship, and cunning. He was formed by a world that demanded swift action and rewarded both brutality and craft. His rise shows how a person from a mobile, loosely organized people could nonetheless build structures of command and influence that rivaled and at times surpassed the ancient urban empires around them. The story of his early rise is full of contingencies and shadows, birthrights claimed and contested, mentors who taught and rivals who schemed, treaties signed at gold-bearing tables, and cruelty enacted on blood-soaked plains. These were the materials of his apprenticeship, and from them he constructed a rule that would leave marks on maps and memories alike. His education was not simply the honing of individual skill, but the creation of an institutional presence that could outlast a single life. So when historians and storytellers later painted him with epithets like Scourge or Flagellum, they were capturing only the surface of a much deeper shape. The making of Attila the Warlord cannot be reduced to war alone. It is a story of how a man learned to marshal goods, hearts, and fears into a functioning polity. His early life prepared him for that synthesis, teaching him how to turn the chaotic energies of nomadic life into enduring authority. And yet, beneath every plan and triumph there remained an unpredictable element, the man himself, flawed and finite. He made choices that stitched his fortunes together but also sowed seeds for future troubles. Even as he became the embodiment of Hun power, he was still the child of a world where day-to-day survival hinged on luck, courage, and the favor of kin. That paradox, between the intimate origins of a stepchild and the continental reach of a warlord, remains the central tension in the story of Attila's formation. The echoes of those early lessons would reverberate in his later campaigns. His capacity for timing, negotiation, and spectacle would bring Rome to the negotiating table again and again, while his instincts honed on the steppe allowed him to exploit fractures wherever they appeared. Yet the making of such a figure always contains limits. Early experiences breed both strengths and rigidities that can become liabilities. Attila's childhood and youth thus shaped not only his rise but the contours of his eventual rule and its vulnerabilities. When listeners picture him in a camp beneath the stars, smoothed hide for a pillow and the smell of stewed meat in the air, they should imagine a man who had learned every aspect of his craft by doing. He was trained to read weather and rumor, to divide spoils and to mete out justice, to cultivate poets and to execute traitors. That comprehensive education made him more effective than a mere warlord. It made him the architect of a new reality in which Rome and the steppe would be forced to negotiate their coexistence. Finally, understanding Attila's early life invites us to see greatness as a product of context as much as of talent. His story reminds us that leaders are made when personal skill meets opportunity and when culture supplies the tools of power. The decades that shaped him were long and hard, and they produced a figure whose reach would change the map of Europe. The level of detail in those formative years, of horsemanship, diplomacy, ritual, and ruthless calculation, explains why his name echoed through the centuries long after he rode his last campaign. Beyond the horizon of recorded memory, where grasses rolled like a restless sea and the sky touched the earth in a single, endless blue, the people we call the Huns emerged into the sweep of European history as a shock of motion and a sharp change in rhythm. They arrived from lands that lie further east than most chroniclers could imagine, crossing rivers and steppes, bringing a culture of horses, bows, and relentless mobility that unsettled borders built on sedentary assumptions. To understand Attila and the height of Hunnic power, we must first listen to the slow, patient preparation of geography and climate, to the way plains and rivers encourage certain kinds of warfare and certain kinds of leadership. The story of Attila and the Huns begins far beyond the neatly drawn maps of Rome, in grasslands where the horizon itself is a road and speed is a kind of knowledge. These were peoples for whom mobility was a craft and war a practice refined by centuries of life on horseback, a way of moving that taught them to strike fast and disappear like a thought. Rome, by contrast, had built its power in stone and law and supply lines and legions drilled in formation, and when the two worlds met it was not merely armies that clashed but entire lifeways. That collision would produce some of the most dramatic pages of late antiquity, scenes of raids and treaties, of massive assemblies around smoky tents, and of moments when empires calculated whether to pay, fight, or bow. To understand Attila's rise, you must first understand the Huns as a force without a single name or origin in the way modern states imagine them. They were a composite of tribes, confederations, and restless bands whose wings spread across the Eurasian steppe, drawing in Turks, Scythians, and other groups through alliances, conquest, and marriage. Their advantage was not simply numbers but tactical innovation, small, fast groups of horse archers who could skirmish, feint, and retreat, leaving heavier, slower opponents exhausted and exposed. Such mobility reshaped the balance on the Roman frontiers, turning centuries-old assumptions about distance and supply into vulnerabilities. When the Huns first appear in Roman records in the late 4th century, they are a new variable in an already volatile equation. The Goths, under pressure from the Huns, sought refuge within Roman borders, a migration that would sow seeds of both cooperation and catastrophe. From that moment, Rome found its northern and eastern borders less like fixed edges and more like porous seams. The introduction of the Huns accelerated migrations, created refugee flows, and forced Roman officials to adapt quickly or risk being overwhelmed by changing realities. Power in Hunnic society moved differently than in Rome. Leadership depended on charisma, military success, and the ability to keep fractious allies bound together. Attila and his brother Bleda inherited a confederation that required constant management rather than simple command, and their early years as joint rulers were a mix of raids, diplomacy, and negotiation with an empire that at first underestimated them. The brothers learned that Rome could be both a source of tribute and a partner in political intrigue. Each treaty was a conversation as much as a transaction, and each invasion both a demonstration of force and a bargaining chip. The Eastern Roman Empire, seated in Constantinople, was the first to recalibrate its relationship with the Huns, offering gold, titles, and trade concessions to buy peace. This was a familiar Roman tactic: use diplomacy and money to secure a frontier when military victory is uncertain. Yet every tribute paid was also a sign of Rome's limits, and every ceremony in which Roman officials showered Hun leaders with gold sowed contempt among some Romans and dependence among others. Over time, these payments became a treadmill: stop them and risk invasion, continue them and erode imperial authority and coffers. Attila's ascent to sole rulership after the death of Bleda is shrouded in rumor and the smoke of subsequent invocations of treachery, but it marks a turning point in Hun-Roman relations. Alone at the apex, Attila revealed not only a masterful talent for war but also a shrewd political instinct. He negotiated when it served him, and he struck with devastating precision when negotiation failed. His campaigns were not merely plunder-driven, they were articulated strategies to expand influence and secure resources crucial for maintaining a diverse and restless confederation. The image of Attila as a mere barbarian leader belies the administrative and diplomatic competence that kept his coalition intact. Between the 430s and the early 450s, the name Attila began to carry weight like a summons, and his diplomacy with both the Eastern and Western empires became the axis around which events turned. He extracted tribute, arranged marriages, and took hostages to assure loyalty, crafting an international position that no previous Hun leader had held. To the Romans, these were affronts and opportunities, humiliations and chances to bind a dangerous ally close to the table. Each treaty read like a truce written in the language of mutual fear. Rome feared Hun aggression. The Huns feared being left without supplies and prestige. A notable strand in this tapestry is the role of internal Roman politics in shaping responses to the Hun threat. Powerful generals, senators, and emperors had different ideas about how to handle Attila. Some preferred to buy peace, others to form coalitions, and still others to manipulate Hun divisions for their own advantage. The Western Empire, weakened by internal strife and loss of manpower, displayed its fragility, while the Eastern Empire used the Huns as a diplomatic foil to pressure Rome or to redirect Hun anger away from its own territories. These shifting calculations often meant that Rome could not present a united front, and Attila exploited that fragmentation with ruthless efficiency. The crossing of the Danube and the campaigns in the Balkans often read like a catalogue of shock and awe, but the true genius of Attila's strategy lay in his understanding of logistics and psychology. He targeted cities that were symbols of Roman authority, not merely for plunder but to demonstrate Rome's inability to protect its own sanctuaries. Towns were burned, populations scattered, and the resulting refugees provided both manpower and propaganda. The destruction of towns and the flow of terrified civilians undercut Roman claims of stability and eroded the aura of invincibility that once surrounded the empire. Attila and his commanders understood that terror could be a weapon as effective as arrows. Raids were designed to be visible, to create a chorus of fear that would multiply their bargaining power. Yet he was not always a destroyer. He understood the value of sparing certain cities to secure treaties, of accepting humiliating terms when it bought time or advantages elsewhere. This selectivity reveals a leader who understood the difference between short-term gain and long-term sustainability, balancing immediate returns with the need for a stable base of power. The Hunnic presence in Europe thus operated on both the edge of chaos and in careful measurements of political effect. One of the most dramatic chapters in this story is Attila's invasion of Gaul, which brought him into collision with a coalition of Romans and allied barbarian groups under the command of Flavius Aetius. Aetius was a consummate Roman general who had cultivated alliances with various Germanic peoples, notably the Visigoths, making his strategy one of build a broader front rather than a purely Roman defense. At the battlefield known as the Catalonian Plains, or Chalons, in 451, the clash became not only a fight for territory but a symbolic contest over who would control the future of Western Europe. The battle was costly and indecisive in many ways, but it marked a turning point where Attila's westward advance was halted by a coalition that matched mobility with heavy infantry and coordinated tactics. The details of the battle itself are complex and hotly debated by historians, but the key point for listeners is that the battle drained Attila's momentum and forced a pause in his western ambitions. The Visigoths fought with a fierce stake in the outcome, and their leader Theodoric I fell in the fighting, a reminder that alliances were made at the cost of lives and dynasties. For Aetius, the engagement preserved Gaul from conquest and restored some measure of Roman prestige in the West, yet it did not deliver a knockout blow to the Hunnic power. Instead, it set the stage for months of maneuvering, raids, and diplomatic recalibration. After the clash in Gaul, Attila turned his attention to Italy, sensing both opportunity and rivalry among Roman elites who were tired of paying tribute. His invasion of Italy in 452 was both bold and calculated. He advanced rapidly, taking cities and cutting crucial routes of communication. Yet Italy presented unique difficulties. Its marshes, mountain ranges, and the resilience of some cities meant that Attila could not simply march unchallenged to Rome itself. The logistical challenges, combined with the political calculations of local commanders and the persistence of Roman diplomacy, made the Italian campaign less decisive than some expected. A story that has become legend concerns the meeting between Attila and Pope Leo I, a meeting that carries the weight of myth and diplomatic theater. The exact content of their discussion is debated among scholars, but the meeting's symbolism is immense, a spiritual leader confronting a warrior king and, by some accounts, persuading him to spare Rome. Whether it was diplomacy, disease, supply shortages, internal Hunnic politics, or a combination of all these factors that led Attila to withdraw, the meeting nevertheless crystallized the idea that Rome could find non-military ways to shape outcomes. Attila's withdrawal from Italy was a complex decision, and it marked the beginning of the end for his major Western enterprises. Throughout these campaigns, Attila's policy combined fear with practical bargaining, and Rome's responses ranged from payment to battle to negotiation, reflecting a state stretched thin. The payments made to Attila were not merely coerced extortions, they were part of a long-standing Roman policy of integrating potentially hostile peoples through gifts and titles. Yet the frequency and scale of payments to Attila signaled declining Roman ability to maintain traditional defenses and to project power in the old ways. For the Huns, these payments supplied wealth and prestige, reinforcing Attila's authority among his own followers and validating his image as a commander who could command the riches of empires. The Hunnic state was not designed to outlast Attila. It was a coalition held together by his personal leadership and the distribution of wealth and plunder. Under his hand, the Huns became a kind of hybrid polity, with captains and nobles bound by loyalty to a figure who could reward success and mete out punishment. When that figure died suddenly in 453, the fragile edifice of Hunnic power began to crack. Attila's death created a vacuum that unleashed centrifugal forces, with subject tribes and defeated groups seeking to reclaim autonomy and fortune. The disintegration was rapid, and within a few years the Huns ceased to be a unified threat to Rome. But the end of Attila's empire did not erase the long-term consequences of Hun incursions and their role in reshaping late antique Europe. The migrations they provoked, the alliances they forged, and the pressures they applied all contributed to the transformation of the Roman world into a patchwork of successor kingdoms. Barbarian leaders who had fought against or alongside Rome began to carve out territorial dominions within the empire's former borders, creating a new political geography. The West would not return to its old imperial unity, and the Huns' role in catalyzing these changes is part of why historians see late antiquity as an era of transition rather than simple collapse. The aftermath of Attila's reign also involved cultural and genetic mingling that is hard to trace but impossible to ignore. Traces of Hunnic influence can be seen in military techniques, in the composition of armies, and in the horse-centered cultures that persisted among successor polities. Roman military tactics adapted too, incorporating more cavalry and highlighting the role of federated barbarian contingents who were paid or granted lands in exchange for military service. Thus, the legacy of the Huns persisted not only in memory and political rearrangement but also in the practical tactical shifts that would shape medieval warfare. Europe, shaped by these shifts, entered a new age where mobility and cavalry rose in prominence. The rhetoric surrounding Attila during and after his life turned him into a symbol both feared and romanticized, a barbarian scourge in some accounts and a legitimate ruler in others. Roman chroniclers, often writing after the events, flavored their narratives with moral lessons, Attila as divine punishment, Rome as the patient sufferer, and Christianity as a force that could stand against raw violence. At the same time, non-Roman accounts and later legends recast him in various lights, sometimes as a heroic, if ruthless, figure in a northern tradition. These varying portrayals reveal as much about the storytellers and their needs as they do about the man who once sat at the center of a vast, nomadic power. Archaeology complicates and enriches the textual record, supplying evidence of Hunnic material culture, burial practices, and weaponry that confirm the hybrid nature of their society. Tumuli and grave goods show a mixture of steppe and European influences, finely wrought metalwork alongside horse harnesses and composite bows. These findings suggest that the Huns were not mindless destroyers but participants in complex cultural exchanges, absorbing technologies and crafts while leaving distinct marks of their own. The burial assemblages also hint at elite displays of wealth that mirrored Attila's ability to redistribute treasure and sustain loyalty among his followers. Not all historians agree on the precise origins or internal structure of the Huns, and debates continue about how to interpret linguistic evidence and the distribution of artifacts. These debates matter because they shape how we understand the ways in which nomadic confederations could influence settled empires. Yet even where specifics remain unclear, the broad outlines, that the Huns were a mobile, adaptable force capable of disrupting established orders, are corroborated by the convergence of textual and material evidence. The uncertainty invites careful reconstruction rather than simple myth-making. In the ebb and flow of diplomacy and warfare, the role of individual personalities cannot be overstated. Flavius Aetius, the Roman general who opposed Attila in Gaul, was a shrewd operator who knew how to balance Roman interests with the loyalties of barbarian federates. His alliance with Visigothic and other non-Roman forces exemplified a new Roman strategy of coalition warfare rooted in political bargaining as much as battlefield tactics. Aetius' own career shows the paradoxes of late Roman power. The empire relied on men it could not fully control, and those men often shaped the course of events in ways that independent historians only partially understood. Similarly, the Visigoths and other Germanic groups were not passive pawns but actors with their own agendas. The Visigothic king Theodoric I and his warriors fought to defend their own territories and to assert their status in a changing Europe. They were as invested in the outcome of clashes with the Huns as were Roman generals, because victory could secure lands, prestige, and the legitimization of rule. The alliance at Chalons thus reflected a convergence of interests and a recognition that the Hunnic threat could only be met by collective action. A recurring theme in this history is the interdependence of diplomacy and warfare, a pattern visible in treaties, hostage exchanges, and marriages that stitch together an uneasy peace. Roman emperors and generals preferred pacts that made enemies into dependents or clients, and Attila used these same institutions to legitimize his position. Marriage alliances in particular were a tool through which he sought to secure loyalty and create bonds with subject peoples, reflecting a diplomatic sophistication often overlooked by those who reduce his career to a catalogue of plunder. Such alliances were fragile and often personal, which meant the political architecture surrounding Attila was vulnerable to his death. The idea of paying tribute to buy peace was often framed by Romans as humiliation, and yet it was a pragmatic response to a reality in which the costs of war exceeded the price of gold. The payment of annual subsidies to frontier peoples was a long tradition in Roman policy, but with Attila these payments reached unprecedented levels and visible symbolism that undermined imperial prestige. This created a tension between realpolitik and ideology. Roman leaders had to reconcile the need to stabilize borders with the expectation that Rome should rule by force and law rather than by giving away its wealth. The inability to reconcile these impulses contributed to political instability within the empire. Religious dynamics also intersected with politics in important ways. Christianity had become a central component of Roman identity, and Christian leaders used the pulpit and diplomatic channels to influence outcomes. The papacy's meeting with Attila resonated because it suggested moral authority could shape secular outcomes, and many contemporaries saw divine favor as part of political fortune. Additionally, different Christian sects and missionary efforts influenced alliances and enmities, and some Hun leaders, like many barbarian rulers, interacted with Christian communities in ways that fused spiritual and political calculations. Climate and ecology play quiet but consequential roles in these narratives. Changes in rainfall patterns, forage availability, and the ecology of the steppe could push nomadic confederations into new territories or force them to seek wealth through raiding. While it's an oversimplification to blame migration solely on environmental factors, these pressures often intersected with political ones, creating a context where the Huns' mobility became not only an advantage but a necessity. Rome itself faced ecological constraints, grain supplies, manpower shortages, and the worry of maintaining long frontiers all shaped imperial choices when confronting Attila. The Hunnic ability to recruit and integrate conquered peoples is an underrated dimension of their power. They did not always rule by pure domination. Often they co-opted local elites, offered positions within their military hierarchy, and adapted useful skills from subjugated peoples. This absorptive strategy explains much about the Huns' rapid expansion and why they could field armies that included a variety of ethnic and cultural elements. It also helps explain why their downfall was so swift after Attila's death. Their cohesion depended less on institutions and more on reciprocal ties orchestrated by a strong central figure. The psychological impact of Attila on Roman elites and commoners alike should not be minimized. His reputation as the scourge of God in some Christian writings captured a fear that extended beyond immediate loss. It reflected anxieties about divine judgment, social disintegration, and the legitimacy of Roman rule. This psychological dimension meant that even rumor and reputation could have strategic effects, prompting preemptive payments, panic-driven flight, and shifts in political alliances. Reputation became a resource, and Attila managed that resource with deliberate narratives of unstoppable might. Economic consequences flowed from the military and political turbulence. Cities damaged by raids lost tax bases and craft infrastructure, rural labor was displaced, and trade networks were disrupted. The cost of defending territories mounted, while the fiscal health of both Eastern and Western courts wavered under sustained pressure. These economic stressors were part of a feedback loop. Military weakness led to fewer resources to defend and rebuild, which in turn encouraged further incursions and political fragmentation. Yet even as we emphasize continuity and consequence, the Huns' influence was uneven across the continent. Some regions experienced devastation and demographic shifts, while others remained relatively unscathed, continuing patterns of local governance and cultural continuity. Local leaders, both Roman and non-Roman, adapted in diverse ways, some fortifying towns and reorganizing militias, others negotiating new arrangements with incoming groups. This patchwork response underpins a larger truth. Late antiquity was not a uniform process of decline but a mosaic of change, resilience, and reinvention. The transformation of military institutions after the Hunnic Wars is subtle but profound. Rome increasingly relied on federated armies. Groups of barbarian warriors settled in Roman lands in exchange for military service, and the lines between soldier and settler blurred. The presence of these groups within the empire both bolstered defense and complicated central authority, as leaders like Aetius depended on them for power. Over time, these federates became power brokers in their own right, shaping post-Roman polities and influencing succession in ways that reflected the new order that emerged out of Hun-era turbulence. As the Hunnic Confederation dissolved, former allies and adversaries carved out kingdoms that would become the foundations of medieval Europe. The Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks, among others, established realms that mingled Roman administrative habits with Germanic custom. In many cases, local elites retained Roman titles and laws, producing hybrid societies where Roman urban life coexisted with new ruling elites. The Huns, by catalyzing migrations and conflict, accelerated this transition and left a legacy in the political landscapes that followed. Memory and myth continued to shape Attila's figure long after his death. Medieval chroniclers transformed his persona, sometimes conflating historical facts with narrative needs, turning him into a symbol of conquest and apocalypse. In art and literature, Attila could be a distant archetype through which societies explored fears of invasion, questions of divine retribution, and anxieties about civilization's fragility. These representations show how historical figures can be refashioned across centuries to embody contemporary concerns. Modern historians approach Attila with a toolbox that includes textual criticism, archaeological analysis, and comparative studies of nomadic confederations. They ask not just what Attila did, but how his actions fit into broader patterns of frontier interaction, state formation, and cultural exchange. This scholarly work has peeled back layers of legend to reveal a leader operating within a complex matrix of diplomacy, military innovation, and political necessity. Yet the debates continue, which is a testament to the richness of the evidence and the enduring fascination with a figure who seemed to emerge from the very edge of the civilized world to shake it. The Huns' material culture invites close attention because it challenges assumptions about what nomadic societies could produce and maintain. Artifacts from Hunnic contexts demonstrate high craftsmanship in metalwork and horse gear, the mobility of artistic motifs across vast distances, and the existence of specialized artisans who traveled with or were integrated into nomadic elites. These material signatures argue against simplistic dichotomies between settled and nomadic societies, showing instead mutual influence and exchange. The Huns participated in networks of trade and craft that extended into Roman territories and beyond, complicating any narrative that paints them as isolated marauders. Another important but often overlooked factor is the role of rivers and geography in shaping campaigns and treaties. Rivers like the Danube were not mere lines on maps, they were lifelines for trade and conduits for military movement. Control of crossing points, bridges, and riverine fortifications often dictated the terms of invasion and defense. Rome and the Huns both understood the tactical value of waterways, and many confrontations turned on the ability to secure passages, keep supply lines open, or deny access to enemy forces. Language and literacy provide further texture to our understanding. The Huns did not leave an extensive corpus of written records, and much of what we know comes from Roman or later sources, which inevitably filtered events through their own lenses. This asymmetry means historians must read between lines and consider how Roman biases shaped accounts of events and motives. Yet this limitation also opens space for more nuanced readings, by comparing material culture, military patterns, and cross-cultural practices. Scholars reconstruct a fuller picture of Hun society and Attila's strategies. The social fabric within Hun society also deserves attention. It was not a monolith, but contained tiers of elites, warriors, commanders, and subject peoples with varying degrees of autonomy. Loyalty had to be continuously negotiated through distribution of plunder and honor, and leaders who failed to do so risked defection and rebellion. Attila's authority rested on both fear and generosity, locking together nobles whose loyalties might otherwise have splintered under the pressure of expansion and scarcity. This internal dynamic explains why his death precipitated such a rapid collapse in organization. Turning to Rome's internal dynamics, the empire's administrative apparatus faced serious strains. Fiscal shortfalls, bureaucratic corruption, and contested succession all weakened the capacity to respond coherently to external pressures. The Western Empire in particular was beset by resource shortages and an erosion of centralized control, making it dependent on ad hoc alliances and generals like Aetius who wielded enormous influence. These conditions created openings for external actors like the Huns to exploit, but they also show how internal rot and external pressure interacted to reshape political landscapes. Attila's bold branding of himself as King of Kings is worth considering because it speaks to his understanding of legitimacy in a world where traditional Roman titles no longer carried exclusive authority. By styling himself in lofty terms and demanding submission from kings and Roman elites alike, Attila sought a place not outside but within the current order of power. His demand for recognition was a bid to transform coercive power into a formal status that would outlast expeditions and raids. That he partially succeeded shows that legitimacy can be crafted through performance, wealth distribution, and diplomatic acts as well as through bureaucratic rule. The interplay between fear and prestige also had a generational effect. Children who grew up in regions affected by Hun campaigns carried memories and trauma that shaped later political attitudes and local identities. Oral traditions preserved tales of sudden invasions, heroic stands, and miraculous survivals, becoming part of communal memory and influencing later cultural productions. These narratives helped cement regional identities that could either resist or accommodate new rulers in subsequent decades. Collective memory thus functioned as a form of social capital in the forging of post-imperial societies. A vital part of the turning of the tide came not from one battle but from sustained systemic adjustments, Rome's building of new alliances, the reorganization of military resources, and the emergence of strong regional leaders who could marshal local power effectively. This decentralization, while marking the end of a unified Roman political order in the West, also created adaptive capacities that would sustain communities and produce new political entities. In other words, the end of one era was the birth pang of another, and the Huns were a catalyst rather than the sole agent of change. Looking beyond immediate military and political consequences, the collision between Rome and the Huns set in motion deep shifts in how Europeans saw themselves in relation to mobility and settled life. The prominence of mounted warfare elevated the status of cavalry and changed noble identities, while settled populations developed new defensive measures and local institutions that would persist for centuries. The cultural osmosis between nomads and settlers changed dress, military practice, and even narrative traditions, so that the medieval world carried traces of these encounters in ways that are still visible today. The story of Attila ends in suddenness, with his death at a wedding feast, and yet the ripples continued to move outward for generations. His demise did not restore the vanished old world but accelerated the formation of successor polities and the diffusion of people who had once been centralized under his banner. In the years that followed, former Hunnic territories were claimed by various emerging powers and by those who had once resisted or served the Huns, producing a fast-moving political reordering across Central and Eastern Europe. The absence of a unifying Hun leader allowed others to step into the vacuum, forging new alliances that shaped early medieval geopolitics. To understand the long arc from Attila's ascendancy to the stabilization of post-Hunnic Europe, one must track the interplay of military innovation, diplomatic creativity, and administrative adaptation. Each party, Roman, Hun, Visigoth, and others, learned and adapted, borrowing tactics and strategies in a process that was creative as much as it was destructive. The turning of the tide against Attila's ambitions was thus less an abrupt reversal than a slow congealing of resistance, realignment, and institutional change that dampened the viability of steppe-centric imperial expansion in Europe. Debates about whether Attila was more a destroyer or a state builder will persist because his career embodied both impulses. He razed cities and also administered tribute, negotiated marriages, and created a political center in the heart of Europe. He was a figure who used every tool available to him, violence, reward, ceremony, negotiation, to build and sustain power, albeit in a form that depended heavily on personal charisma. In this way, Attila was of his time, a leader molded by the chaotic frontier between steppe and empire, crafting a polity that reflected the demands of mobility and the lure of settled riches. Modern retellings often struggle with the tension between myth and history, tempted to emphasize spectacular raids or moralistic narratives rather than the slow, systemic interactions that defined the era. A balanced view recognizes that Attila was both a catalyst for rupture and an actor operating within a wider world of change. He accelerated trends that were already underway and forced institutions to adapt in ways that had lasting significance, a role more complex than simple villainy or heroism. Understanding this complexity requires patience and a willingness to hold ambiguity without forcing tidy conclusions. As you consider the long trajectory from the steppe to Rome and back again, it helps to visualize the landscapes on which these events unfolded: river valleys where armies crossed and retreated, misty plains where horsemen flickered in and out of sight, and cities whose monuments stared down centuries of tumult. These are the stages on which humans, with their mixtures of greed, fear, artfulness, and courage, enacted dramas both intimate and epic. The Huns and Attila were not anomalies but actors in a long, dynamic story of interaction across Eurasia that would feed into the shaping of medieval Europe. In the final accounting, Attila's importance lies not only in the immediate devastation he wrought but in how his campaigns forced the reimagining of power in a world where mobility mattered more than it had in centuries. The Roman response, uneasy, inventive, sometimes heroic, helped forge political forms and alliances that would endure in new guises. The turning of the tide against Attila in the West was a process marked by coalition building, logistical adaptation, and the emergence of leaders who could harness diverse forces. But the full transformation of Europe was a long process in which the echoes of Attila's thunder continued to shape decisions and identities for generations. Listening to this story today, we see how the clash of different social organizations, nomadic coalition, and sedentary empire produced a crucible of change. Attila's career illuminates the ways military innovation, diplomatic maneuvering, economic pressure, and cultural exchange interact to reshape the political map. The Huns were both agents and symbols of change, and Attila stands as an exemplar of how individual agency can hasten broader historical transitions. In the lesson of these centuries, we find a reminder that empires are resilient but not invulnerable, and that transformations often come from the margins pushed into the center. History does not end neatly at Attila's death. Rather, his campaign set in motion a series of adjustments that culminated in new polities, cultural syntheses, and military practices. The former Roman provinces metamorphosed under the rule of Germanic kings who adopted Roman administrative forms while bringing new customs to governance. This blending laid the groundwork for medieval kingdoms and for the eventual reconstitution of political life in Europe at a different scale and composition. The reverberations of Attila's era thus extend into the medieval narrative, a bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages. Finally, the story of Attila and the Huns teaches a simple but profound lesson about history, that moments of crisis can accelerate change and force societies into creative responses. When Rome faced a mobile confederation capable of reaching its heartlands, solutions came not as one grand victory but as 1,000 small adjustments, alliances formed and dissolved, towns fortified, military doctrines revised, and leaders learned to negotiate across cultural divides. Those adaptations, taken together, changed Europe. In understanding the clashing with Rome and the turning of the tide, we see a world remade by movement, by negotiated survival, and by human beings who fought to make new orders from the ruins of the old. The night Attila died is the kind of image that lodges in the imagination, a tent pitched in the dark, a man who had shaped the fate of nations lying still after celebration, and the uneasy hush that follows the end of a long winter war. The accounts we have are few, fragmentary, and tangled with rumor, but they converge on one stark sensation, a sudden end to a life believed to be inexhaustible. It is the contrast between the violence of Attila's public life and the private, almost accidental, manner of his death that has given the story its enduring drama. Listeners who picture generals falling on battlefields might be surprised. This death, intimate and final, reshaped history in a way a pitched battle never had to. Attila's final night comes down to us through the pen of Priscus, the 5th century diplomat who met him, and through later chroniclers who savored moral meaning more than meticulous chronology. In the year 453, after a campaign of diplomacy, plunder, and the negotiation of tribute with the Eastern Roman Empire, Attila is said to have taken a new bride, a woman named Ildiko. They celebrated, they drank deeply, and then, according to several sources, Attila bled from the nose and mouth in his sleep and died. Some tell this as divine judgment against a man who thought himself above fate, others as an unfortunate medical episode, and still others suggest deliberate poisoning or a coup in the dark. The medical explanation is surprisingly plausible given the facts the ancient writers preserved. Attila was no young man when he died. He had ridden hard for decades, with injuries from battles and the rough life of the steppe. Excessive drinking at a wedding, perhaps combined with erosive disease or an arterial rupture, could have led to a catastrophic hemorrhage that the attendants could not stop. Ancient and modern physicians alike have pointed to a likely fatal epistaxis, a nosebleed that filled the throat, or a ruptured aneurysm, and to the ignorance of the moment that allowed a treatable condition to become lethal. But the human appetite for conspiracy has never been far from the scene. A rival might have slipped a poison into a cup, or a discontented wife might have struck in her anger, or a plotted assassination could have been staged with a blade. Jordanes and other later chroniclers mention Ildiko by name and allow rumor to thicken into accusation. She is, in some versions, the murderer. These are the details people wanted, because the sudden demise of a titan needs a face of treachery to be comprehensible. Yet the contemporary evidence does not support a neat solution. What is left is a plausible accident and the shadow of suspicion that people love to cast. After the night came the funeral, and funerals were where culture and power unveiled themselves most clearly. The Hunnic funeral of their king is described in extravagant terms, a secretive, even macabre ritual said to have included the slaughter of many attendants and animals to accompany Attila into the grave. Jordan's, writing with Gothic bias and Christian moralism, tells a story of a burial so secret that the ground where Attila lay was plowed and trampled by horses before being reflooded, and that the river hid his grave forever. The image of a ruler buried in secrecy beneath a river swirls with metaphor and might be partly invented. Nonetheless, it speaks to the shock his death caused and to the Huns' determination to prevent desecration or looting. Priscus offers a different kind of echo, more sober and less lurid, rooted in the eyewitness style of a diplomat. He recorded scenes of mourning, the bewildered faces of allies and vassals, and the immediate collapse of the carefully maintained web of allegiance that Attila had woven across the plains and into the Roman frontiers. The Hunnic Empire, if it can be called that, relied not on formal institutions but on personal loyalty to a charismatic warlord. When the center is removed, the spokes fall away. This is a pattern that recurs in steppe polities where power is intensely personal. The mechanics of Hunnic authority were a mixture of coercion and exchange. Attila extracted tribute, demanded hostages, and took lands under temporary occupation, but he also granted titles and gifts and allowed local kings to remain in place as long as they paid and provided troops. His was a pragmatic overlordship, more a system of network dependencies than an empire of bureaucrats. That pragmatism depended, however, on a very strong leader who could hold the disparate pieces together by charisma, fear, and the steady distribution of wealth taken from Rome and other sources. When he died, no formal line of succession had been prepared that could command the same respect. Attila's sons were young men thrust into roles for which the whole system of allegiance was ill-suited. Elik, the oldest, claimed leadership, and Dingizic and Enak were the other names put forward in the sources. Rival chiefs among the subjugated peoples, Goths, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Heruli, and others, smelled freedom. They had been waiting for a moment like this, for the webbings of tribute to unravel and for the chance to reclaim autonomy. Powerful on paper, Attila's legacy had been brittle beneath the surface. The year after Attila's death, the Battle of Nideo in 454 became the decisive moment of that unraveling. Allied subject peoples rose under the leadership of Ardaric of the Gepids and other Germanic chieftains, and they fought to throw off Hunnic overlordship. The battle, fought on the plains of Pannonia, ended badly for the Huns. Elik perished in the fighting, and the Hunnic coalition collapsed into fragmentation and retreat. The victory was not simply a military reversal for Hunnic power, it was the legal and social refounding of many peoples who had been under Hunnic sway. In the aftermath, many of the subject peoples east of the Danube reasserted their independence, and the region slid into a new configuration of kingdoms and federations. The Ostrogoths and Gepids set up their own realms, and other groups migrated westward or southward, seeking new lands in a Europe that could not sustain the old equilibrium. The power vacuum created by Attila's death and the defeat at Nideo accelerated a larger process of migration and realignment that had been underway for decades. What had been a terrifying, focused center of power dissolved into a scatter of ambitions and opportunities. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine that the Huns simply vanished like a puff of smoke. Some Hunnic groups remained active players in the decades that followed, taking service as mercenaries, settling in Roman territory, or shifting their territories to the steppe margins. The Byzantines, always adept at turning potential enemies into foederati, recruited Hunnic cavalry into their own armies, embedding Huns in late Roman military structures. The Huns became part of the fabric of post-Attilan Europe, not as a dominant power but as a thread woven into many new patterns. Their military techniques, attire, and technologies disseminated widely. The composite bow, the tactics of mounted archery, and the elite emphasis on mobility had already been part of steppe warfare, but the Huns brought those skills into a closer and sometimes brutal contact with the Roman world. Romans adapted their military thinking in response, adopting some cavalry tactics and reorganizing their frontiers. The contact was a two-way street. Romans influenced Huns with coinage, luxury goods, sedentary techniques, and the lure of wealth that could be converted into loyalty. One of the most persistent myths about Attila and his people is the stirrup story, the idea that the Huns introduced the stirrup to Europe and thereby enabled a revolution in heavy cavalry. The tale makes sense emotionally, a small technical change producing a military revolution. Modern scholarship largely rejects the neat causality, pointing out that stirrups arrived in Europe by complex routes and over time, and that mounted shock tactics were not solely dependent on stirrups. The Huns certainly practiced forms of mounted combat that emphasized speed, feigned retreat, and devastating counterattacks, but the deeper military changes in late antiquity were incremental and cross-cultural. Attila's relationship with Christianity and with Roman religion was ambivalent and strategic rather than doctrinal. Some of his subjects were Christians, and he sometimes allowed bishops and clergy to keep their positions. Christian chroniclers, however, had a moral template that cast Attila as a pagan scourge or even as a divine instrument of punishment for Rome's sins. Pope Leo I's famous meeting with Attila in 452, whether it was diplomacy, intimidation, a negotiation for tribute, or a miraculous turning aside, became in later Christian imagination a scene of holy confrontation. The truth likely lay in pragmatic negotiation, with the papal presence serving to humanize the encounter and present the costs of sacking Rome as greater than the expected gain. The campaign of 452 into Italy is also revealing of Attila's goals and limits. He devastated cities, demanded ransom, and terrorized the Italian peninsula, but he did not establish a long-term settlement in central Italy. Reasons for this halt include logistic challenges, the march of winter, disease among his troops, or calculated returns on ransom instead of conquest. Political calculation and the realities of supply and resistance made pure destruction less profitable than extracting tribute. Attila's approach to Italy exemplified a balancing act between plunder and power projection. The Roman world, already under stress from internal division and economic strain, could not absorb Attila's pressure without altering itself. The empire paid or fought, negotiated or collapsed, and in doing so, Roman leaders sometimes pivoted away from old alliances and practices. The Hunnic threat accelerated reforms and adaptations, military recruitment drew on different peoples, frontier defenses changed shape, and diplomacy became more flexible. In a broad historical sense, this is where Attila's shadow falls, not only in the immediate geographic destruction but in the momentum he injected into a changing late antique world. The archaeological record gives us a stubbornly physical counterpoint to the literary narratives. Graves attributed to Hunnic contexts contain horse gear, weaponry, and personal ornaments that reflect steppe nomadic life and cross-cultural exchange. Salted with Roman coins and luxury items, these finds document the flow of wealth from sedentary centers to mobile warriors. They also complicate any idea of a homogeneous Hunnic culture. The material culture shows adaptation, trade, and the adoption of local customs by different groups allied to the Huns. These graves and hoards also raise questions about identity. Who were the Huns in terms of language, kinship, and self-identification? The sources are tautologically unhelpful. They call many people Huns at the same time that Hun functions as an umbrella term used by Romans to describe steppe raiders. Linguists and historians have proposed Turkic, Yeniseian, Mongolic, Iranian, and mixed origins for Hunnic language and elite nomenclature. The lack of direct written testimony in the Hunnic tongue leaves us reliant on names recorded in Greek and Latin, which are filtered through phoneticization and cultural bias. Genetics and archaeology have opened new windows but also created new puzzles. Recent genetic studies of steppe burials show an immense complexity of ancestry, with people moving and mixing across Eurasia over centuries. The Huns, like many steppe polities, were likely a confederation of tribes with varied ancestries and languages. They recruited from conquered peoples and allied groups, assimilating some and ruling others, which makes any simple linguistic or ethnic labeling hazardous. In other words, the Huns as a political formation were fluid. Their identity was governed as much by allegiance and a shared military ethic as by common blood. The cultural memory of Attila in European storytelling reflects a long moral arc. In Roman and Christian writings, he is the Scourge, a cautionary figure of divine punishment. In Germanic epic, he becomes Etzel, a noble but tragic figure in the Nibelungenlied, where myth and history weave into a heroic saga. In medieval and Renaissance art and drama, Attila oscillates between villain and tragic monarch, a cipher onto which moral lessons about power, greed, and fate are projected. The shifting image tells us as much about the societies that remembered him as about Attila himself. Across centuries, Attila's image has also been mobilized for modern national narratives. In the 19th and 20th centuries, nationalist historians in Hungary and elsewhere sometimes embraced Attila as an ancestral figure or as a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. That movement of historical figures into nationalist service shows how the past is never neutral. It is claimed, reshaped, and used to shore up present identities. For historians, Attila's story thus serves as both a study in late antique geopolitics and as a mirror for later cultural anxieties. The Hunnic legacy also includes immediate legal and social changes in the regions they had once dominated. Germanic kingship, for instance, evolved partly in response to Roman and Hunnic pressures, blending Roman administrative techniques with Germanic custom and steppe ruthlessness. Federate arrangements, where Germanic troops served Roman emperors in exchange for land and payment, were facilitated by the power vacuums and bargains that emerged in part because of the Huns. These arrangements eventually helped shape the medieval political landscape of Western Europe. Moreover, the Hunnic era forced Rome to confront the limits of its own power and to innovate in governance and diplomacy. The Eastern Empire, in particular, became adept at playing the game of divide and conquer among steppe groups, using subsidies and marriages to turn potential enemies against each other. Roman diplomacy, backed by gold and patronage, could co-opt attached coalitions and render transient victories in place of permanent conquests. This diplomatic adaptability is part of Attila's legacy. Empires learned to treat steppe confederations not only as military threats but as political actors to be negotiated with. Beyond political arrangements, the Huns left marks on artifacts and fashion. Crescent-shaped pectorals, certain styles of horse harness, and embellished clothing show stylistic nods that migrated into frontier cultures. These things are small but telling. Material culture tends to outlast political forms, and the daily accoutrements of mounted life filtered into neighboring societies. When later groups adopted similar gear, they were not copying the Huns alone but absorbing a shared step repertoire that the Huns had helped circulate across the continent. The mythology of Attila's burial has also prompted centuries of treasure hunting and speculation. If the grave was indeed hidden under a river or concealed under a reflooded field, it would be the kind of burial designed to escape grave robbing, a final act of control by a ruler who could not bear the idea of posthumous indignity. William of Rubruk, Marco Polo, and many other travelers and chroniclers relished the idea of rich graves waiting to be discovered, promising artifacts and a tangible link to the dramatic past. For scholars, the lack of a known Attilan grave serves as a caution against imposing tidy archetypes on fragmentary realities. Even the geography of post-Attila Europe bears his mark. Pannonia and the lands north of the Danube became a frontier mosaic where migrating peoples established new centers of settlement and power. Attila's campaigns had altered settlement patterns, pushing some communities toward Roman territories and opening new opportunities in depopulated regions. Over time, those resettlements hardened into new polities with roots that reached back through a period of turbulence that Attila had helped catalyze. Another thread of legacy is military recruitment. The late Roman armies increasingly relied on barbarian foederati, groups who fought under their own leaders but for Roman pay and territory. Hunnic soldiers, both before and after Attila, often found roles as mercenaries in Roman armies. Their skill at mounted archery remained prized, and the assimilation of steppe fighters into Roman military structures supported the transition of the Roman army into a medieval force. The professionalization and ethnic variety of late antique armies had long consequences for the military histories of successor states. The memory of the Huns in Byzantine records is complicated by diplomacy and propaganda. Emperors sometimes depicted Huns as barbarians to rally civic virtue and justify payments, yet they also admired their military prowess and courted Hunnic leaders through titles and marriage alliances. The Byzantines were adept at turning enemies into clients, and this approach softened the edges of hostility. Hunnic elites who entered Byzantine service adapted their identities, sometimes becoming integrate parts of Byzantine military aristocracy and even converting to Christianity as part of diplomatic assimilation. Stories about Attila's personal character vary wildly, a sign of how storytelling informs reputation. Roman poets and moralists called him a scourge, broadening a theological motif that barbarian invasion was divine retribution. Gothic and Germanic epics sometimes reimagined him as a tragic regal figure bound by fate, patient and proud rather than merely monstrous. Some contemporary observers admired his discipline, his shrewd diplomacy, and his ability to inspire fierce loyalty. Others emphasized cruelty and greed. These contradictions tell us that Attila was many things at once and that his persona was manufactured as much as it was observed. Attila's court, as recorded by Priscus, was a place where East and West met awkwardly and profitably. Byzantine and Roman missions came bearing gifts and gold to negotiate peace, and the Huns reciprocated with hospitality measured in feasts, gifts, and displays of power. Attila cultivated an image of magnificence. His tents were described as glittering with gold and precious objects. and his retinue included captive nobles and warriors whose submission was a sign of his authority. This orchestrated theater was as effective as any battle in communicating domination. The structure of Hunnic leadership under Attila included subordinate kings and tribal leaders who were permitted autonomy in return for tribute and martial support. This is visible in the list of rulers who paid homage to Attila and in the arrangements that allowed Gothic kings to retain their thrones. It was a system built on flexible hierarchies and personal bonds rather than codified law. Flexibility made the system resilient under a strong leader, but also brittle when the leader disappeared, which explains much about the rapid collapse after Attila's death. Religious life among the Huns remains an interpretive puzzle. Priscus observes rites and customs that suggest shamanistic or animistic practices, while the presence of Christian clergy among their subjects complicates the picture. The Huns likely accommodated multiple religious expressions within their polity, seeing faith as part of social cohesion rather than doctrinal control. This pluralism fits the pattern of nomadic empires that administered people of diverse belief systems through tolerance and patronage rather than centralized religious orthodoxy. The economic foundations of Hunnic power also received less attention than their violence. Tributes paid by Rome and other polities were central to paying warriors and sustaining the elite. Beyond tribute, the Huns profited from plunder, control of trade routes, and the labor of subject peoples. Their economy was predatory and extractive but could also be integrated with local economies through trade and long-term settlement in frontier regions, making the Huns both disruptive and entangled with the broader Mediterranean economic system. The Huns' relation to the Silk Road and broader Eurasian exchange is intriguing. They were part of a chain of steppe peoples whose movements stretched across the continent and affected the flow of goods, technologies, and people. While not the sole drivers of Eurasian integration, the Huns participated in a network that transmitted styles of horse gear, metalworking techniques, and even certain administrative practices across long distances. Thinking of them as regional disruptors misses their role as conduits of cultural and technological exchange. Historiographical debates have long centered on the question of continuity. To what extent did later peoples like the Magyars or Bulgars inherit traits from the Huns? Nationalist historiography sometimes embraced direct descent as a flattering lineage, but mainstream scholarship prefers to speak of influences rather than biological continuity. The Huns were an important node in a web of interactions, and their cultural footprint can be discerned in burial rites and martial practices. But the notion of a single unbroken line from Attila to later conquerors is more myth than evidence-based history. When we look at literature and opera, Attila is a lyrical figure. Verdi's opera Attila made him a symbol of tyranny and resistance, using his story to comment on power and its limits. In epic poetry, the figure of Etzel becomes a stage upon which moral dramas are played, and medieval chroniclers used him to illustrate divine punishment or historical inevitability. These artistic appropriations show how a historical personage can be retooled into an archetype, a process that transforms specifics into moral or aesthetic lessons for later audiences. The modern fascination with Attila often says as much about our own anxieties as about past realities. In periods of fear about migration or the collapse of institutions, Attila is sometimes evoked as a cautionary emblem of barbarians at the gate. In times of romantic nationalism, he becomes a heroic progenitor. The mutability of his image is a reminder that history is not only a study of what happened but also a conversation about who we are and whom we choose to remember. Attila's death also raises questions about the nature of leadership on the steppe. Charismatic authority was effective but inherently fragile, since it depended on personal bonds rather than institutional succession. The Huns' post-Attila fragmentation demonstrates the danger of personalization without structural remedies. The lesson is timeless. Systems built around single figures are resilient while the leader lives, and brittle the moment the leader is gone. The ethnographic complexity of Hunnic bands also feeds the story of their legacy. They included not only ethnic Huns in any modern sense but Slavs, Goths, Alans, and others who had been incorporated by conquest or alliance. This mixture meant cultural borrowing on both sides and a shifting map of loyalties that could tilt away from a central power without warning. The multi-ethnic reality of steppe confederations complicates any narrative seeking to claim them as simple ancestors of later nations. The Hunnic presence in the Black Sea region left toponyms and local memories that lasted for generations. In Crimea and along the lower Danube, settlements bore traces of Hunnic rule in their pottery, fortifications, and burial practices. Local elites negotiated with the Huns, sometimes becoming clients and sometimes remaining semi-independent, a negotiation that reshaped local power structures and trade. These local consequences mattered because history is the sum of such small, incremental changes rather than only great battles. A parallel thread of legacy is the psychological effect on Roman and post-Roman societies. The fear of mounted nomads shaped military recruitment, urban defense, and even cultural perceptions of the other. The image of swift, ruthless horsemen haunting the steppe became part of a long memory that influenced medieval siegecraft, frontier fortifications, and diplomatic caution. Psychological legacies like fear and respect can outlast immediate political changes and can shape strategies for generations. Language and nomenclature preserved in Roman and Byzantine texts show Hunnic names with Turkic-sounding elements as well as ones that might be of other origins. Names like Attila, Bleda, and Dingizic tease linguists but do not solve the puzzle. The onomastic evidence suggests borrowing and linguistic interaction, which is precisely what a political confederation would produce. A mosaic of names and terms reflecting many tongues rubbing shoulders together. In later centuries, the image of Attila as Scourge of God altered theological debates. Some theologians used him rhetorically to talk about divine punishment, historical providence, and the morals of nations. The idea that barbarian invasions were instruments of providence allowed chroniclers to interpret suffering as moral correction, a way of reconciling catastrophe with the belief in a purposeful cosmos. Attila's freezing into a theological symbol shows how historical events are folded into cosmic narratives. The idea that Attila could be both a scourge and, in certain stories, a noble ruler underscores the multiplicity of lenses through which history is read. For some, he represented the brutishness of nomads. For others, he was a model of heroic plunder and martial excellence. Both elements existed in his real politics, brutality and strategic calculation, cruelty as well as diplomacy. This duality made him a convenient figure for storytellers who wished to moralize about power, and it demanded that historians disentangle rhetoric from probable reality. Even the map of Europe owes something to the Huns' movements. Their push into the Roman world displaced populations, which then pushed others, setting off chains of migration that contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the reshaping of Europe's ethnic map. While Attila did not directly cause the empire's fall, his actions and the general instability of the period were accelerants in a crisis that had many causes. The Huns were one powerful variable among many in the complex equation of late antique transformation. Archaeologists have sometimes found the kinds of horses, bridles, and bits associated with Hunnic cavalry, and technological analyses of bows and metallurgy help reconstruct how Hunnic warfare functioned. The Huns' composite bows, with horn and sinew laminations, required skilled craftspersons and knowledge passed across Eurasia. The weapons and gear were part of a material world that made their style of warfare possible and that could be absorbed by other groups willing to emulate the steppe repertoire. The story of Attila's marriage to Ildiko, whether or not she killed him, is emblematic of the human interest in private moments of great people. Wedding feasts, love affairs, betrayals, these are the narrative devices that turn political history into personal drama. Chroniclers emphasize them because they make causality feel intimate rather than systemic. If a marriage or a poison can topple a great man, then history is accessible in its personal scale. In reality, personal drama and structural forces interact in messy ways, a fact that makes reconstruction both difficult and fascinating. Relics and legends grew around Attila after his death. Monasteries and noble houses claimed artifacts, relics, or even spectral visits by the king in dreams to validate piety or property. These stories served social functions. They reinforced claims, created myths for community identity, and satisfied a human hunger for connections to the past. The historical Attila became a palimpsest on which later communities wrote their fears, hopes, and claims. Ethnogenesis, the process by which new peoples form, was accelerated in the century after Attila, as groups combined, split, migrated, and settled. In this churning environment, identities were remade. Some groups that had been federates of the Huns became independent polities with their own ruling structures and cultural practices. The post-Hunnic period was an incubator for new political formations that would shape the medieval world. The story of Attila's death is also a cautionary tale about the limits of conquest. Great power can be startlingly brittle when it rests on personal charisma rather than institutional depth. The Huns' rapid rise and fall argue against simplified models of steppe conquest as monolithic domination and emphasize the fragility of empires built on fear. For listeners today, that is a modern morality tale. Centralized brilliance can be followed by equally rapid unraveling when succession fails. The role of water and rivers in the Attila story is striking. Rivers were both strategic obstacles and burial myths. The claim that Attila was buried beneath a river captures the symbolic power of water as both boundary and erasure. Rivers divided worlds and also hid treasures, and the mythology around Attila's burial resonates precisely because it uses landscape to dramatize disappearance. The symbolic use of geography is one of the ways ancient authors made sense of sudden change. One cannot discuss Attila without returning to the primary sources and appreciating their limits. Priscus offers the most reliable contemporary account, but it is partial and focused on diplomatic episodes. Roman chroniclers wrote with agendas, political, religious, and moral, that colored their portrayals of the Huns. Later medieval writers recast the story to suit their own narratives, producing layers of meaning rather than a single transparent account. Modern historians must therefore weave these threads cautiously, aware of bias and interested in context. Anthropological comparisons to other steppe polities help us interpret Hunnic social structure. Much like the Mongol Confederation centuries later, Hunnic power was grounded in mobile warfare, charismatic leadership, and flexible alliances. Comparisons can illuminate probable patterns, such as the importance of mounted archers, the role of marriage alliances, and the centrality of horse culture. without collapsing distinct times and peoples into a single stereotype. These analogies should be used as heuristics, not as proofs. The immediate diplomatic aftermath of Attila's death included renewed negotiations between the Eastern Roman Empire and various steppe groups. Byzantine foreign policy under Theodosius II and his successors sought to stabilize borders, playing Huns off against other tribes and sometimes co-opting Hunnic leaders with titles and land. The empire's resilience in diplomacy was in part born of necessity. The Eastern Roman state survived by adapting, and the end of Attila's reign required a new kind of nimbleness in handling steppe relations. Folklore preserves oddities that hint at deeper truths. Stories of Attila's treasure hidden under a river, of phantom Hunnic camps, or of dreams of the great king persisted in local oral tradition long after the political world that produced him was gone. Folklore functions as community memory, encoding anxieties about wealth and violence and about the ephemeral nature of conquest. When historians read these tales as emotion rather than fact, they gain a different, valuable kind of evidence about the cultural afterlife of Attila. The Hunnic influence on law and custom in frontier regions was subtle but real. In some areas, practices of raiding, tribute exaction, and negotiated autonomy left legal traces in how property and allegiance were understood. The presence of steppe models of leadership influenced Germanic kings who had to contend with mobile neighbors, and the idea of personal oaths and retinues became more pronounced in certain post-Roman polities. Legal transformations are slow and diffuse, but the shadow of the Huns can be traced in the changing ways peoples handled violence and authority. Religious conversion among former Hunnic adherents is another long-term story. Some Hunnic elites adopted Arian or Orthodox Christianity as they entered the orbit of Roman and Gothic kingdoms, using conversion as a diplomatic tool to secure alliances. Conversion served practical purposes. It signaled willingness to integrate and made political marriages easier. Religious identity thus became another lever in the remapping of post-Hunnic political space. The Hun story also intersects with the larger narrative of Eurasian migrations, a continuous tide of movement that reshaped societies from the steppes to the Mediterranean. Attila's campaigns were one episode in this sweep, a flashpoint in a long era of connectivity that moved peoples, goods, and ideas across enormous distances. This perspective places the Huns in a grand tableau of mobility, rather than isolating them as anomalous marauders. Attila's personal charisma was not only martial but also theatrical. He staged displays of generosity and ruthlessness with equal adeptness, offering lavish gifts to secure loyalty while terrifying opponents into submission. This performative element of rulership is common across cultures. Power must be demonstrated as well as exercised, and Attila's court was a theater where prestige was both currency and weapon. The performative style of steppe rulers was instrumental in securing short-term obedience and in shaping long-term memory. The fall of Attila's network also tells us about the limits of coercion. Forced alliances are inherently unstable. They require constant attention and frequent redistribution of wealth to keep them intact. Without Attila's energetic governance, the redistribution faltered, debts were unpaid, and old grievances resurfaced. This is a lesson about governance that resonates across ages. Coercive systems without institutionalized channels for legitimacy and succession are vulnerable to rapid collapse. The personal names recorded among Hunnic leaders illuminate the patchwork nature of their ruling class. Some names likely have Turkic roots, others perhaps Iranian or Germanic elements, and some are lost in the distortions of transcription. This onomastic mosaic suggests a polity composed of interwoven elites who maintained local identity while participating in a larger political structure. The diversity of names is a small but telling mirror of the Huns' composite nature. Archaeological assessments of cattle burial practices and elite horse interments provide a glimpse into religious and social priorities. Horses were central to status and to the economy of mobility. Their presence in graves speaks to beliefs about the afterlife and to the social value placed on mounted prowess. The Huns' funerary practices resonated with steppe norms, and these practices spread subtly into neighboring cultures that adopted the prestige goods and symbols of mounted elites. The Huns' engagement with coinage is instructive. They did not produce a vast currency of their own but used Roman and Byzantine coins widely, redistributing them as currency of loyalty. This monetary behavior underlines how the Huns plugged into existing economic networks rather than creating separate financial systems. It also meant that Roman bullion amplified Hunnic power by serving as a portable and recognizable asset useful in diplomacy and reward. The famous meeting between Pope Leo I and Attila in 452, whether a diplomatic success or a narrative construct of ecclesiastical writers, symbolizes the interface between barbarian power and Roman spiritual authority. If negotiation occurred, it demonstrated the Pope's political weight in a world increasingly shaped by martial rulers outside direct imperial control. If the meeting was embellished, it nonetheless reflects the aspiration of the Church to act as a peacemaker in a world of fractured secular authority. Artistic portrayals of Attila through the centuries oscillate between monstrousness and tragic grandeur. Medieval miniatures, Renaissance portraits, and Romantic literature all took liberties, sometimes magnifying his ferocity and at other times humanizing him as a great leader undone by fate. These portrayals reveal as much about contemporary aesthetics and political sentiment as they do about historical Attila. Art, after all, refracts history into the concerns and values of those who create it. The image of Attila as a scourge has sometimes been invoked to justify imperial policies in later times. Rulers used his memory to warn against moral laxity and to rally populations under the banner of divine favor. The rhetorical deployment of Attila's memory became a political instrument long after his death, a weapon turned by those who sought to influence public opinion through historical analogy. On the ground, the experience of peoples who lived through Hunnic incursions varied widely. Some communities suffered brutal raids and displacement, others negotiated survival via tribute and alliance. The human cost was immense in some areas but less in others, depending on geography and the presence of defendable fortresses or the willingness of local elites to negotiate. These local variances make the Hunnic period a tapestry of different experiences rather than a uniform era of catastrophe. The Huns also left traces in legal documents and treaties that show how governments adapted to dealing with mobile threats. Treaties often included clauses for the payment of subsidy, hostage exchanges, and agreements about land use. The formalization of these practices into agreements shaped later diplomatic conventions for dealing with steppe polities. Legal continuity emerges here in unexpected ways, through the adaptation of Roman legal forms to the realities of steppe politics. The question of whether the Huns had a written language or administrative script is intriguing but likely negative. No Hunnic script has been convincingly identified. Their governance relied on oral command and the material symbols of power, such as regalia and distribution of goods. The lack of written administrative records helps explain why their voice is mediated through Roman and Byzantine writers. It also points to the oral nature of steppe political culture. Continuity and transformation in the centuries after Attila show the different paths taken by the peoples he oppressed and allied with. Some retained elements of steppe military organization, while others adapted Roman civic forms into new kingdoms. The transition from late antiquity to the early medieval period is thus not only about decline but about synthesis. New political forms emerged that blended Roman administration, Germanic kingship, and steppe military culture. The symbolic weight of Attila's death lingers because it is a hinge moment in a sweeping historical change. One man's end precipitously altered a political constellation, exposing how dependent some historical systems are on individual agency. Thinking about that hinge encourages a nuanced view of causality. Historical changes are rarely the result of a single event, yet sudden incidents can accelerate processes already in motion. Attila's death was such an accelerator. Across centuries, the Huns were alternately demonized, romanticized, and appropriated for nationalist sentimentalities. The multiplicity of these readings is itself part of the Hunnic legacy. Attila remains a flexible emblem of power, a figure who can be vilified or lionized depending on the needs of the moment. The endurance of his image in European consciousness is striking. He remains a cultural touchstone precisely because he resists simple categorization. Finally, when we try to imagine the end that Attila's death brought, we must balance the theatrical image of a secret burial or a sudden hemorrhage with the slow churn of social transformation. The Huns did not so much vanish as they dispersed into a new order, their techniques, personnel, and ideas absorbed into successor polities. Attila's death closed a chapter of concentrated power but opened many smaller chapters of cultural exchange, political innovation, and the remaking of Europe. To listen to the long hum of history after Attila is to hear both silence and echo. The immediate silence was the political silence of a vanished court, the dissolving of alliances, and the respite of peoples who had been under his yoke. The echo was the diffusion of steppe practices, the reshaping of borders, and the memory of a leader whose name became a warning and a fascination. That combination of silence and echo is the true legacy of Attila, an abrupt cessation followed by a centuries-long aftersound that continued to shape Europe's story. Thus, the death of Attila is not merely an anecdote about a king who bled in his sleep. It is a pivotal moment that helps us see how personality, military technology, economic exchange, and diplomatic ingenuity can conspire to build vast empires, and how fragile those empires can be without institutional depth. The Huns' legacy is stitched into the political, military, and cultural fabric of post-Roman Europe. In every corner from the Danube to the Black Sea, traces linger in material culture, in genealogies of power, and in the imaginations of the peoples who remembered and reused their story. If we are to take a final contemplation from this vast interplay of fact and myth, it is that history is always a negotiation between what can be known and what must be inferred. Attila's last night sits at the intersection of eyewitness testimony, rumor, and the moralizing instincts of later narrators. The Hunnic legacy resists tidy closure, and perhaps that is fitting. A people defined by movement and mixture leaves a complicated inheritance, one that rewards persistent attention and invites endless retelling. For listeners driving home or pacing a late room, that complexity is precisely the point. History holds its power in the stories it refuses to let go of, and Attila is a story that will not be silent. Subscribe now, or let Attila's shadow haunt you forever. And write in the comments, will history remember you as a feared warrior, or erase you as a coward forgotten by time?